They arrived in Asia with almost nothing, no power, no territory, only the resilience they carried from Baghdad. Yet over the decades, this one family would illuminate Hong Kong, shape its skyline, and build an empire strong enough to survive every political storm Asia ever faced. The Kadoories were never kings, but they became something quieter and far more enduring, the hidden custodians of a city the world once ignored. Where others saw a barren island, they saw potential, a gateway between China and the world. They invested in electricity, hotels, real estate, and finance, creating the foundations of modern Hong Kong long before anyone else believed in its future. Today, their companies power most of the city, host its world leaders, and influence billions in global commerce. But their true genius was not wealth, it was survival. They learned to thrive under every empire without belonging to any of them. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy calm, cinematic documentaries like this, subscribe to Money Vault for more stories of hidden dynasties and forgotten empires. Now, let's begin the rise of the Kadoorie Dynasty. Chapter 1. Roots in Exile. The early Kadoories and the long journey east. Long before their name became woven into the fabric of Hong Kong, the Kadoories lived a life marked by movement, a journey shaped less by ambition and more by necessity. Their story begins not among skyscrapers or electric grids, but in the quiet, sun-washed streets of old Baghdad, where generations of Jewish families had lived for centuries in a delicate balance of tradition and uncertainty. The Kadoories belonged to a community known for its merchants, scholars, and artisans, people who had mastered the art of endurance in a region where stability often drifted as softly and unpredictably as desert wind. Their world was shaped by the soft sounds of markets opening at dawn, the sermons heard through narrow alleyways, the hum of families who carried their history not as a burden, but as something quietly cherished. But like many families of the era, they lived at the edge of forces far beyond their control. The 19th century brought political tremors through the Ottoman Empire, subtle at first, then stronger, reshaping lives that had once seemed steady. Commerce shifted. New powers pressed in. Old systems began to fray. And for families like the Kadoories, each year brought new uncertainty about the world they would inherit. This was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow loosening, the kind that reveals itself in small ways. An opportunity lost, a partnership dissolved, a sense, felt more than heard, that the ground beneath them was shifting. The Kadoories, observant and adaptive, understood the message quietly forming around them. It was time to look outward. Their journey east began gently, almost without fanfare. They did not travel with ships laden in wealth or entourages marking their status. They left as so many refugees and traders had left before them, carrying knowledge, discipline, and the hope that somewhere beyond the familiar rhythms of their homeland, a more stable horizon waited. From Baghdad, they moved toward the ports of the Indian Ocean, entering a world shaped by the ebb and flow of global trade. Coastal cities hummed with languages, faces, and customs from every corner of the world. British influence was growing. Chinese merchants traveled with quiet purpose. Indian markets pulsed with a life entirely their own. The Kadoories stepped into this landscape with the same calm attentiveness that had always guided them, observing first, listening always, choosing each next step with patience rather than urgency. Bombay, today's Mumbai, became their first true anchor. It was a place of movement, ships arriving at dawn, clerks filling ledgers under the glow of lantern light, merchants navigating a growing colonial economy that blended opportunity with uncertainty in equal measure. Here, the Kadoories began rebuilding not with noise, but with careful precision. They entered modest trades, learned the rhythms of the port, and built small networks that would, over time, become the threads of something far larger. They were not wealthy yet. They were not powerful yet. But they were steady, and steady people survive where others fall away. In these early years, the family learned a lesson that would define their destiny. That survival is not about holding ground, but about knowing when to move, and how gently to do it. It was in Bombay that they first heard whispers of a remote island along China's southern coast, a rocky, humid place dismissed by most traders as unremarkable, unprofitable, and plagued by illness. Hong Kong. Most investors ignored it, but the Kadoories listened, They sensed something in that place, a small harbor with a future hidden beneath its obscurity, and slowly, patiently, they prepared to follow the tide northward, not as conquerors, not as empire builders, but as a displaced family carrying knowledge, strategy, and the quiet determination to rise again. Their journey toward Hong Kong had begun, and though no one could see it yet, the foundations of a dynasty were already being laid, softly, gently, one deliberate step at a time. The journey from Bombay to the ports of East Asia was not a single leap, but a series of gentle movements, each guided by intuition rather than certainty. For the Kadoories, the Indian Ocean was not merely a stretch of water, but a corridor of opportunity, connecting worlds shaped by different empires, different customs, and different rhythms of life. They traveled along routes used for centuries by merchants seeking quieter horizons, following monsoon winds that carried ships toward China, Singapore, Burma, and Siam. These waters, calm on some days and restless on others, became the silent backdrop to a transformation none of them could yet imagine as they moved eastward. The family encountered a new kind of world, one where British colonial power took the shape of administrative offices and fortified harbors, where Chinese traders blended ancient traditions with modern ambition, and where the early sparks of industrialization began altering the pace of life in subtle, irreversible ways. For the Kadoories, everything felt unfamiliar, yet strangely welcoming. They had never sought dominance. They sought stability. They had never sought attention. They sought opportunity. They had never demanded space. They created it with patience. And in each new port they reached, they carried with them the skills refined across generations, skills that traveled further than any possession they might have lost along the way. They knew how to assess risk without fear, how to build trust without force, how to observe quietly until the right path revealed itself. These qualities, unremarkable at first glance, would eventually become the pillars of their rise. Arrival in Shanghai. A glimpse of what Asia could become before Hong Kong became their destiny. The Kadoories spent time in Shanghai, a city that, even in the mid-1800s, carried a faint glow of what it would one day become. The air felt different there, more charged, more uncertain, more alive. Along the Bund, ships from Europe anchored beside Chinese junks and steam-powered vessels newly built in British docks. Clerks moved through offices with the urgency of people aware that history was shifting beneath their feet. Merchants negotiated in a dozen languages, each carrying their own ambitions. But the Kadoories did not rush to plant roots here. They watched, they listened. They studied the silent structure of power shaping Shanghai, a structure that rewarded knowledge and punished impatience. The city's energy revealed something to them. China's coastline would one day dominate global commerce, and the ports feeding into it would become the gateways of that transformation. Yet Shanghai, for all its momentum, was too crowded, too contested, too shaped by European interests. The Kadoories sensed that their future lay somewhere quieter, a place where potential had not yet hardened into competition. And so they looked south, toward a place still considered an afterthought of empire. First glimpse of Hong Kong at the time. Few saw Hong Kong as anything more than a rugged landscape with uncertain prospects. Dengue fever and malaria were common. Roads were barely formed. The city itself was only beginning to take shape under British administration. But the Kadoories saw past the discomforts. They saw past the shallow assessments that dismissed the island as inhospitable. What they noticed instead were the fundamentals: a deep natural harbor, the position directly facing mainland China, a sheltered coastline perfect for shipping, and a future that only patient eyes could recognize. To the world, Hong Kong seemed insignificant. To the Kadoories, it felt like a beginning, a blank page waiting for someone who understood the value of time. They traveled there not with certainty, but with quiet resolve. And in those early days, when the island felt more like a frontier than a city, the family began planting the seeds of a destiny that would one day illuminate an entire skyline, not with noise, not with haste, but with the soft, steady confidence of people who had already rebuilt their lives once and were prepared to do it again. Their story was still unfolding gently, almost imperceptibly, but a shift had begun, a subtle realignment of fate that would one day turn refugees into power brokers and a neglected island into the center of Asian commerce. When the Kadoories finally stepped onto the shores of Hong Kong, the island did not greet them with the grandeur that now defines its skyline. There were no towers, no neon reflections across Victoria Harbor, no crowds rushing through cavernous stations. Hong Kong, in those early years, felt closer to a frontier than a city, humid, rugged, and shaped by the rhythm of the sea rather than the pulse of industry. But sometimes, the places that appear smallest are the ones with the widest horizons. The British saw Hong Kong as a strategic port, a foothold in the evolving trade routes of East Asia. Chinese villagers saw it as a place of work, a place where fishing families lived in wooden stilt houses that swayed with the tides. And foreign merchants saw it as a temporary stop, a way station to larger opportunities elsewhere. The Kadoories saw something different. They noticed the way the harbor held ships safely even in heavy storms, the way mountains created natural protection around the settlement, the way the ocean narrowed into a channel that funneled trade directly toward the island's shores. These details, subtle, overlooked, revealed a future that only attentive minds could recognize. Hong Kong, for all its discomfort and uncertainty, felt like a beginning. The quiet work of learning a new land. The family did not rush into investments. They did not declare plans. They did not attempt to seize influence in a place still defining itself. Instead, they observed the city's quiet mechanics. They walked through markets where Cantonese merchants sold cloth and dried fish. They visited shipyards where laborers carved planks beneath the heavy heat. They watched how British officers managed the growing settlement, and how local Chinese families adapted to the new order. They listened more than they spoke, and by listening, they learned what others could not see. This island, small, humid, and still rough around the edges, would one day become the doorway between China and the world, a place where East and West would intertwine not through force, but through necessity, a place where trade would accelerate faster than any port in Asia, a place worth investing in slowly, patiently, deliberately, a modest beginning in trade and finance. The Kadoories started with the simplest of ventures, small trading operations rooted in the skills they carried from generations of mercantile experience. Their early businesses were not glamorous: textiles, household goods, supplies for the growing British administration. But each step, no matter how modest, helped them understand the rhythms of the city. They learned which goods moved fastest, which merchants kept their word, which relationships could grow into opportunities, which risks felt too sharp for the stability they valued. And little by little, their presence deepened. Their reputation, calm, dependable, fair, spread quietly through the city's commercial circles. While others chased quick fortunes, the Kadoories focused on something more lasting, establishing themselves as trusted figures in a community that had no shortage of uncertainty, a family rooted in resilience despite the hardships they had faced: exile, displacement, the unpredictability of empire. The Kadoories never allowed their past to harden them. The calm discipline they learned in Baghdad, the patience they practiced in Bombay, and the attentiveness they refined across Asia all gathered into a quiet strength that now guided them through Hong Kong's early years. At a tea night, when the city dimmed into near silence, they would sit in their modest home overlooking the harbor, listening to the sound of water tapping softly against the shore. It was in these moments that they understood how far they had come and how much further they could go. Hong Kong was not yet a center of wealth, not yet a city of light, not yet a symbol of global commerce, but it held the potential to become all of those things, and the Kadoories, with their gentle persistence, were preparing themselves to shape that transformation, not through conquest, but through the quiet, steady work of laying foundations. The story of their dynasty had not yet begun to rise, but the roots were settling into place, deep enough to endure storms, flexible enough to shift with the tides, strong enough to hold the weight of a legacy that would eventually reshape an entire city. Chapter 2. A City Awakening: The Early Kadoorie Ventures and the Birth of Modern Hong Kong. As the years passed, Hong Kong began to shed its identity as a distant outpost and slowly emerged as a place where opportunity settled like morning fog over Victoria Harbor. The transformation was subtle at first: a new shop opening along a dusty road, a shipyard expanding its reach, a warehouse rising near the shoreline. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Yet each small change whispered of the city Hong Kong would one day become. For the Kadoories, These whispers were signals. They could feel the city's rhythm beginning to form, pulsing gently beneath the surface. The harbor carried more ships each season. British control became more administrative than exploratory, and the local population, fishermen, traders, and families navigating the uncertainty of colonial transition, began to grow into a community with its own internal structure. This was the environment in which the Kadoories found their first meaningful footholds. A family learning the cadence of a young city. Hong Kong in the late 1800s was not yet defined by wealth or industry. It was defined by possibility, a rare space where the future had not yet chosen its direction. In this space, the Kadoories moved with a quiet confidence, applying the lessons gathered from their long journey eastward. In Baghdad, they learned how quickly stability could dissolve. In Bombay, they learned how patient strategy builds resilience. In Shanghai, they learned that opportunity is often found in the shadows of larger powers. And now, in Hong Kong, they applied all three. They spent long hours walking the docks at dawn, watching the way ships were loaded and unloaded with practiced rhythm. They observed the colonial administration's efforts to establish order. They listened to Chinese workers who understood the island's temperament far better than any foreign observer could. Their early ventures, textiles, commodities, small-scale financing, were building blocks, not destinations. They tested ideas gently, avoiding unnecessary risk, always searching for the spaces where unmet needs quietly gathered. Electricity, a vision emerging in the darkness. Hong Kong was growing, but one essential element remained missing: light. The streets dimmed into near darkness each evening. Homes relied on kerosene lamps that flickered in the humid air. Shops closed early because working after sunset was difficult and unsafe. The harbor, despite its strategic potential, became a near-invisible landscape after nightfall. Where most saw inconvenience, the Kadoories saw a future industry. Electricity, still new and imperfect, carried the promise of transforming Hong Kong from a modest trading post into a thriving modern city. They understood something that would later define their empire. Cities do not grow because of ambition. Cities grow because someone builds the systems that allow ambition to breathe. If Hong Kong were ever to become the gateway between China and the world, it needed power, steady, controlled, dependable power, and the Kadoories began quietly positioning themselves to meet that need. The first steps toward a larger vision. Before investing in generation or infrastructure, the family studied the city's habits. Who needed electricity first? Where would demand grow? How quickly could supply scale with population? How would British authorities regulate the sector? These were not speculative questions. They were careful, patient inquiries, the kind that reveal opportunity only to those willing to move slowly enough to see it at the same time. The Kadoories began building relationships that would outlast every political era. Shopkeepers in Shenzhen, British officials in Central, community leaders in Kowloon, and Chinese merchants who understood the city's deeper rhythms. While others underestimated Hong Kong, the Kadoories were mapping its future. Each conversation, each observation, each carefully chosen investment, all of it pointed toward a single truth quietly forming in the family's collective mind. Hong Kong would one day be a city illuminated by its own potential, and they would help provide the light. A dynasty in its earliest shape. The Kadoories were still far from wealthy there. Businesses were still fragile. Their influence was still forming. But something subtle and powerful began taking shape within their identity. A recognition that they were no longer merely surviving exile. They were beginning to build, not loudly, not rapidly, but steadily, in the background of a young city finding its form. And though the world around them could not yet see it, the foundations of a dynasty, one that would one day power Hong Kong, house its leaders, and weather every political storm, were already emerging, quietly, calmly, inevitably. By the late 1800s, Hong Kong had begun to form the early outlines of a modern city, though much of it was still wrapped in shadows. After sunset, the island felt almost suspended in darkness. Dim lanterns glowing faintly in alleyways, kerosene lamps flickering inside wooden homes, shops closing not by choice, but by necessity. The nights were quiet, still, and surprisingly fragile. And yet, within this darkness, the Kadoories sensed the first true doorway into the city's future. Electricity had begun spreading across parts of the Western world, but in Asia it remained a rarity, a curiosity, a luxury, a promise not yet fully understood. In Hong Kong, the concept felt distant. The population relied on routines that had existed for generations. After dusk, the island simply slept. But the Kadoories were not interested in the present. They were interested in what the present could become. While other merchants focused on textiles, trade, and quick profits, the Kadoories studied something different: the city's pulse. They watched the movement of people after sunset, the routes taken by workers returning home, the spaces that remained unused because the night offered no light to guide them. They observed the British administration's efforts to modernize infrastructure, noting where progress slowed and where opportunity quietly pooled. Electricity was not simply a commodity; it was a foundation, a skeleton on which an entire city could be built. Seeing what others overlooked, few investors believed electricity had a future in Hong Kong. Some saw the population as too small. Others saw the terrain as too difficult. Many believed the island's role in the region would remain limited, a staging ground, not a destination. But to the Kadoories, Hong Kong's limitations were not obstacles. They were indicators of how early they were, how much room the future still had to form. They understood something fundamental: a city's potential reveals itself long before its buildings do. Electricity represented not light, but possibility: extended work hours, safer streets, functional industry, and a harbor that could operate beyond daylight. The Kadoories recognized that whoever controlled this lifeblood would shape the pace, structure, and direction of Hong Kong's rise. The slow engineering of a power empire before committing to any investment. The family undertook the same ritual that had guided them across continents. They listened. They spoke softly with engineers, ship captains, colonial administrators, and local workers who understood the island's geography intimately. They visited parts of Hong Kong where light almost never reached, learning how people lived, how they moved, and how their routines might change if darkness became optional. Most importantly, they studied population growth with an almost meditative patience. Each new household, each newly constructed building, each ship that docked in the harbor signaled future demand. A slow, steady rise that, to an inattentive observer, seemed insignificant. To the Kadoories, it was a pattern, and patterns, when observed gently and without haste, reveal direction. Laying the first cables, the family began making small, deliberate investments, not in massive infrastructure, but in the essentials: tools, skilled technicians, early equipment, land that would one day hold power stations. Their approach was subtle, almost invisible. While larger firms competed loudly for shipping contracts or banking privileges, the Kadoories built the foundation of something more enduring: a system that would one day provide the pulse of the entire city. Their philosophy remained unchanged: move slowly, study deeply, build quietly. Let the future come toward you rather than chasing it. The city begins to glow. Years passed before the effects became visible, but gradually, like the first hints of dawn spreading across a silent harbor, Hong Kong began to glow. That a shop in Central lit its interior after sunset, that a warehouse extended its operating hours. Street lamps flickered along the waterfront, casting trembling reflections across the water at night. People spoke softly of how different the city felt: safer, busier, more alive. No one yet understood who was behind this transformation. And the Kadoories preferred it that way. Their influence was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be structural, a quiet presence woven into the daily rhythm of the city. The beginning of a new identity. By stepping into electricity, the Kadoories were no longer simply merchants. They were becoming architects of Hong Kong's future, shaping the very infrastructure that would carry the city into the modern era. And though their empire was still forming, still fragile, still unfolding in careful increments, its trajectory had already changed. The darkness that once covered Hong Kong each night was fading, and with every new light that flickered to life, a new future took shape, one that would forever bind the city's destiny to the Kadoorie name. As Hong Kong's nights slowly filled with light, the city began to shift in ways even its own residents could not fully articulate. There was no single moment when everything changed, no dramatic unveiling, no thunderous announcement. Instead, the transformation unfolded softly, like a curtain being drawn back to reveal a wider horizon. Shops stayed open a little longer. Dock workers moved through the harbor with greater confidence. Families gathered under steady lamplight instead of flickering kerosene flames, and each evening, the glow along the waterfront deepened, casting a gentle shimmer across Victoria Harbor. The Kadoories watched all of this quietly. Without seeking recognition, they were engineers of possibility, not inventors, not politicians, not visionaries in the theatrical sense, but people who understood how infrastructure could strengthen a city from its bones outward. Electricity made Hong Kong feel less like a frontier and more like a place preparing itself for the future. But for the Kadoories, this was only the first step to a growing city with growing needs. As the population increased, so did the demands placed on the island's fragile systems. Water had to be transported, roads needed reinforcement, warehouses needed expansion, homes required safer materials, and businesses, sensing stability, began investing more heavily in local operations. Each of these needs revealed new pathways, not for profit alone, but for shaping a city that was learning how to stand on its own. The Kadoories stepped into these spaces gently, always with the kind of caution that had guided every move since they left Baghdad. They invested in small logistical networks, experimented with storage facilities, and began financing ventures that, while unimpressive on the surface, hinted at the deeper role they would eventually play. Their empire was not being built in leaps, that it was being woven, one careful thread at a time. Listening to the heartbeat of the community, unlike many colonial-era businesses that operated at a distance from the local population, the Kadoories sought connection. They spoke respectfully with Chinese shopkeepers, understanding that these were the people who truly knew the city's needs. They listened to fishermen who explained the shifting tides. They learned from craftsmen who understood which materials could withstand Hong Kong's storms and humid summers. They observed the flow of human movement across neighborhoods, not just during the day, but at night, where electric lights slowly unlocked new patterns that the family. Every conversation was a lesson, every observation a quiet blueprint. And from these interactions, one truth became increasingly clear. A city's growth is not driven by wealth alone. It is driven by trust, by relationships that hold firm when everything around them changes. Foundations for something larger. The Kadoories' early successes created a subtle momentum, not loud, not celebrated, but steady. Their power operations expanded. Their financial ventures grew more structured. Their influence became a soft current running beneath the city's surface, guiding, supporting, strengthening. They began purchasing land not for prestige, but for long-term vision, parcels that would later become key to Hong Kong's development, locations chosen not for immediate gain, but for their quiet strategic value. Slowly, their presence shifted from that of newcomers to that of quiet stewards. People who understood Hong Kong's strengths and vulnerabilities in equal measure. A family preparing for the unknown despite their progress. The Kadoories remained acutely aware that the world around them was far from stable. Empire was never permanent. Markets fluctuated. Political winds shifted without warning. And the history of their own people had taught them that even success must be carried lightly. But it was this awareness, this understanding that the ground could move at any time, that made them build with such deliberation. They constructed their early ventures not like towers, but like anchors, low to the ground, deeply rooted, capable of holding steady even if storms approached. And soon, the storms would come: wars, occupation, political shifts that would redraw borders and rewrite futures. But long before any of that, in these early, gentle years, the Kadoories were laying the groundwork for a dynasty that would survive what others could not. Not through force, not through influence, but through a steadfast commitment to endurance. Hong Kong was awakening. And the family who once arrived with uncertainty now found themselves becoming the quiet architects of its rise. Chapter 3. Storm on the Horizon. The Kadoories enter an era of global upheaval. By the early decades of the 20th century, Hong Kong had settled into a quiet rhythm, a city no longer defined by uncertainty, but not yet shaped by the wealth and density that would come later. Its harbor glimmered at night beneath the electricity the Kadoories helped foster. Its roads stretched further inland, and its people moved with a sense of calm routine. But beyond the calm, the world had begun to tilt. subtle at first, shifts in political tension, murmurs of unrest in distant capitals, changes in the tone of conversations between British administrators and Chinese intermediaries. The Kadoories, who had always been attentive observers, felt these changes with the same sensitivity that had allowed them to survive every transition before. Hong Kong, for all its progress, still lived in the shadow of empires. And empires were beginning to drift, a city caught between powers at the time. China was undergoing a transformation unlike any in its long history. The old imperial order had collapsed. New leadership struggled for direction. Foreign influence pressed in from every angle, creating a landscape where certainty felt like an illusion. Hong Kong, though sheltered under British rule, felt these tremors through whispers passed in tea houses, shifts in trade patterns, and the subtle unease that moves through. A city when the future grows harder to predict. The Kadoories did not panic. They had lived through uncertainty in Baghdad. They had navigated the fragility of Bombay's colonial economy. And they had built their lives in Hong Kong precisely because it offered a kind of neutrality, a place where resilience mattered more than allegiance. But now, they sensed that neutrality itself would soon be tested. The quiet preparation for instability, the family responded as they always did, not with dramatic reactions, but with gentle recalibration. They reviewed their accounts with unusual care, studying where their businesses were most exposed and where they were most grounded. Their investments became more cautious, shifting not away from Hong Kong, but deeper into the sectors that had always carried them: electricity, hospitality, land. They strengthened relationships across communities, understanding that in times of turbulence, partnerships mattered more than power. And through all of this, they maintained the calm demeanor that defined their identity. They were not merely preparing for change. They were preparing to withstand it. The rise of a new family member, Ellie Kadoorie. Around this period, one figure began emerging quietly at the center of the family's future. Ellie Kadoorie, soft-spoken yet remarkably perceptive, he carried a gentleness that masked an extraordinary discipline. His mind moved in the slow, deliberate patterns of someone who understood that long-term vision required calm above all else. Where others saw risk, he saw structure. Where others saw instability, he saw the need for patience. And where others hesitated, he observed just long enough to understand the deeper currents shaping the moment. Under his influence, the family deepened their involvement in industries that would later form the backbone of their empire. Electricity, because a growing city cannot function without it. Real estate, because land holds value even when markets tremble. Hotels, because movement across Asia was increasing and travelers needed places where safety and comfort could coexist. These choices were not ambitious. They were strategic, not loud, but enduring. Hong Kong before the storm. During these years, Hong Kong felt suspended between eras. The last breath before the world around it changed in ways no one could fully comprehend. Ships continued to pass through the harbor with rhythmic grace. Workers walked home beneath new electric lamps. Merchants filled the streets with soft conversation, and families settled into routines shaped by the quiet stability the Kadoories helped create. Yet beneath this tranquility, the sky had already begun to darken. Beyond the horizon, geopolitical tensions brewed, tensions that would reach Hong Kong with a force few imagined. The world was moving toward a conflict that would tear through Asia, redraw borders, and push every business, community, and family into unimaginable trials. But long before the storm arrived, the Kadoories were already preparing, not for victory, but for survival, not for expansion, but for endurance, not for influence, but for continuity. Their empire, still young, was about to face its greatest test. And as Chapter 3 begins, the family stands at the threshold of an era where resilience would matter more than ever, and where the foundations they built would determine whether their dynasty would rise or be swept away. The 1930s settled over Hong Kong with an uneasy stillness, a kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like the gentle pause before something shifts. Life continued as it always had. Ferries crossing the harbor at dawn, merchants unlocking their shutters, clerks sorting papers beneath the hum of electric lights. But beneath these everyday sounds, a subtle tension threaded itself through the city's routines. News traveled slowly then, drifting across Asia in fragments. rumors from Shanghai, whispers from Tokyo, cautious conversations in British clubs. Each piece felt small, almost insignificant on its own. But together, they formed an unsettling pattern, one that the Kadoories understood with a clarity sharpened by generations of displacement. The world was moving toward conflict, and Hong Kong, sheltered though it seemed, would not remain untouched at a calm family in an unsteady world in moments like this. Many in the colony reacted with nervous speculation. Some withdrew their capital. Others questioned their future in Asia. A few convinced themselves that Hong Kong's status as a British port would be enough to keep danger at bay. But the Kadoories approached this period differently. Not with panic, but with the same composed observation that guided every phase of their rise. They sensed that the region's political winds were shifting faster than the city's outward calm suggested. They noticed subtle changes in the way officials spoke, in the urgency carried by telegrams arriving from abroad, in the slight tightening of the colonial administration's daily routines. Where others saw ambiguity, the Kadoories saw preparation. Where others feared, they calculated. Where others hesitated, they listened more closely. Their focus was not on predicting the conflict, but on ensuring they would endure it. Strengthening the foundations, the family reviewed each branch of their growing empire with quiet precision. Their power operations, essential to Hong Kong's functioning, were reinforced with additional equipment and reserves. Their real estate holdings were adjusted to prioritize stability over profit. Their hotel operations maintained their elegance, but prepared for reduced travel and tighter budgets. Their financial exposure was carefully minimized, shifting from volatile markets to assets that would withstand economic shocks. None of this happened abruptly. None of it was broadcast. Each adjustment was gentle, deliberate, a kind of internal softening that allowed the structure to bend rather than break. The Peninsula Hotel, a sanctuary on borrowed time by this time. The Kadoories had taken control of what would become one of their most iconic assets. The Peninsula Hotel, elegant, calm, and perfectly positioned overlooking the harbor, the hotel represented something rare in Asia, a place where travelers found comfort, where diplomats met discreetly, and where the family's quiet philosophy took physical form. The peninsula was not built for spectacle. It was built for refuge. Its polished floors, soft lighting, and attentive service created an atmosphere of steady composure in a region that felt increasingly unsettled. Guests who walked through its grand entrance often felt a strange sense of tranquility, as though the world outside slowed for just a moment. But the Kadoories understood the truth hidden beneath its beauty. No sanctuary exists forever. War would eventually reach Hong Kong. And when it did, even the peninsula, their pride, their symbol of endurance, would be swept into the same storm that threatened the entire region. Still, they maintained it with care, believing that buildings, like families, can carry emotional significance that extends beyond practicality. Signals from the mainland across the border. China was already grappling with turmoil, political fragmentation, external threats, internal conflict. Shanghai, once a beacon of commercial optimism, felt increasingly unstable. Letters from friends and business partners carried a tone of weariness, uncertainty, and quiet alarm. The Kadoories understood that Hong Kong's fate was tied to China's, geographically, economically, emotionally. What happened there would inevitably ripple outward. And so, with each passing month, they grew more attuned to the fragile balance holding the region together. Their daily routines remained calm, but their decisions carried a deeper weight. Preparing for the unknown as tensions escalated throughout Asia, the Kadoories continued to act with a softness that belied the seriousness of their preparation. They never rushed. They never reacted impulsively. They simply adjusted, gently, consistently, as if tuning their operations to match an approaching change in the atmosphere. Their guiding principle remained unchanged. Stability is not found in resisting uncertainty, but in learning to move with it. And so, as Hong Kong stood on the edge of the greatest upheaval in its history, the family who had arrived as refugees now found themselves quietly ready, not to confront the storm, but to survive it. For in the calm before conflict, the Kadoories sensed a profound truth. Empires might fracture, governments might fall, borders might shift, but the ability to endure, to stay steady as the world tilts, was the most powerful inheritance they carried. The storm that the Kadoories sensed approaching did not arrive suddenly. It crept toward Hong Kong with the slow, deliberate certainty of a tide advancing across a quiet shore. And when it finally reached the city in 1941, it swept away every structure, physical, political, emotional, that had once made Hong Kong feel secure. The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong was not simply a military event. It was a total collapse of the world the Kadoories had spent decades understanding. Electricity grids faltered, trade routes dissolved, hotels emptied, daily life, once predictable, became fragile overnight. And yet, in the middle of this disintegration, the family's endurance, shaped by exile, migration, and generations of quiet resilience, revealed itself more clearly than ever before. The fall of the peninsula on a December morning, the unthinkable occurred. Japanese forces entered Kowloon, advancing with a momentum no defense could contain. Within days, the beloved Peninsula Hotel, the symbol of elegance the Kadoories had nurtured, was seized. Its polished floors echoed with foreign boots. Its grand lobby, once filled with soft music and murmured conversation, became a command center. Its windows, facing the harbor, witnessed the collapse of the colony in real time. The building survived, but its spirit, the calm confidence it once offered travelers, dissolved into the uncertainty of occupation. The Kadoories themselves were in grave danger. Their prominence, their foreign identity, and their influence placed them in a precarious position. Some members were forced into camps. Others lived under constant threat, and every day carried the weight of questions that had no answers. Yet, even here, amid fear and deprivation, they maintained a quiet dignity. A family scattered, but not broken. The occupation tore apart the routines that once defined their lives. Basic resources dwindled. Communication became almost impossible, and the careful systems the family built, accounting ledgers, business plans, power operations, vanished under military rule. But the Kadoories had something rarer than infrastructure. They had resilience that had been refined through generations of uncertainty. They had survived forced migration from Baghdad. They had rebuilt in Bombay. They had adapted in Hong Kong. And now, though everything around them fell apart, the inner posture that defined their dynasty, calm, patient endurance, remained. The city in silence. Hong Kong during the occupation felt unfamiliar, even to those who had lived there their entire lives. Streets once filled with commerce now echoed with emptiness. Shops shuttered. Electricity flickered unreliably. The harbor, once alive with ships, stood still under military control. The silence of the city was perhaps the most haunting change. It carried the weight of survival. Slow, heavy, uncertain for the Kadoories. This silence became a space of reflection. With their businesses dismantled and their routines broken, they confronted the fragility of everything they had built. But in this fragility, they discovered something important. Their dynasty had never been defined by infrastructure. It had been defined by endurance. And endurance was something war could not erase. Holding on to identity in a world unmade during these years, the family clung quietly to the values that had carried them through every chapter of their journey: dignity, patience, and an unwavering belief that life, however dark, moves in cycles. They learned to live with less. Move carefully. Wait, not with despair, but with the soft understanding that survival is sometimes a matter of outlasting the moment. This was not the rise of their empire. This was the preservation of it, the protection of spirit, identity, and memory when the world around them offered no guarantees. A light that could not be extinguished even in the hardest months of occupation. There were moments when the family sensed a faint glimmer of the future, not in news, reports, or political rumors, but in the simple endurance of the people around them. Neighbors sharing food quietly, strangers offering comfort in passing. A child laughing amid backdrop of rubble, electricity flickering briefly back to life after days of darkness. These small signs reminded the Kadoories of the truth that anchored them across continents. Survival is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is made of gentle, persistent breaths. One day, then the next, and so they waited, held on, endured, not knowing when the war would end, but trusting that when it did, the family who survived exile, migration, and now occupation would rebuild again, quietly, steadily, inevitably. The storm had taken nearly everything from them, but their capacity to endure, the quiet strength at the core of their identity, remained untouched, and from that strength, the next chapter of their dynasty would rise. Chapter 4. After the darkness, the Kadoories returned to a broken city. When the war finally loosened its grip in 1945, Hong Kong did not awaken with celebration that it stirred slowly, cautiously, like a city relearning how to breathe after years spent in silence. Shops opened with trembling doors. Boats crept back into the harbor, their hulls weathered and thin. Families emerged into streets they no longer recognized. Places where memories of the past and debris of the present blended in quiet, unsettling layers. And into this fragile dawn stepped the Kadoories, returning not to the prosperous colony they once helped illuminate, but to a city hollowed by absence. Their hotels were damaged. Their power operations were stripped down to their bare machinery. Their records, decades of careful planning, were gone, and the peninsula, once the pride of their growing empire, stood like a wounded monument, its grandeur muted by years of occupation. Yet as they walked through its shattered halls, there was no despair in their footsteps, only a familiar calm, the same quiet resilience that had carried them from Baghdad to Bombay, from refuge to opportunity, from darkness into endurance. The family returning with nothing but memory. Many families would have seen devastation here, loss so overwhelming it overshadowed every attempt to rebuild. But to the Kadoories, the destruction carried a different message. Where others saw ruin, they saw a blank page, a beginning, a chance to shape Hong Kong again, this time with deeper understanding and a renewed sense of purpose. They had lost much, but they had not lost the capacity to rebuild. Their wealth was diminished, but their knowledge remained intact. The quiet knowledge of how to listen to a city, how to read its needs, how to restore stability in places where chaos had left deep cracks. And that knowledge, refined over generations, was enough. The first steps toward renewal. Hong Kong's infrastructure had collapsed during the occupation. Electricity was sporadic. Water systems barely functioned. Industry had ground to a halt. Travel was dangerous. And the people, tired, hungry, wary, lived each day with the weight of uncertainty that had not yet lifted. The Kadoories understood that rebuilding would not begin with grand gestures, that it would begin with essentials. They walked the streets of Kowloon, listening to workers describe shortages. They visited the demolished substations that once powered neighborhoods. They studied what remained of their own business records, searching for threads they could gather into something steady. And little by little, they began repairing the pieces of Hong Kong that mattered most. Lights flickered back to life, first in small clusters, then across wider streets. Generators hummed in neighborhoods that had been dark for months. Technicians returned to work, guided by the same patient leadership that had shaped the pre-war years. The Kadoories did not rush. They rebuilt Hong Kong's electricity layer by layer, knowing that stability is never created through speed, but through rhythm. Restoring the peninsula, a symbol of hope. Reclaiming the Peninsula Hotel was an emotional moment for the family. Its floors were scarred, its windows shattered. Its once elegant halls carried the quiet heaviness of memory. But even in ruin, the building retained a presence, a dignity that had not been extinguished by war. The Kadoories understood that restoring the peninsula was not merely a business decision. It was an act of healing. They brought in craftsmen who worked slowly, carefully, returning marble floors to their soft sheen, restoring wood panels that had absorbed years of sorrow, replacing chandeliers that once cast gentle light through the lobby. As the hotel came back to life, so did Hong Kong. That it became a place where people gathered again, where travelers found reassurance, where the city's spirit began to stitch itself back together, quietly, gently, almost imperceptibly. Rebuilding Hong Kong's heartbeat. Electricity flowed more steadily with each passing month. Businesses reopened, ships returned, street markets gained their familiar hum, and slowly, the Kadoorie influence expanded, not through force, but through necessity. Hong Kong needed light. Hong Kong needed stability. Hong Kong needed the patient hands of people who understood how to rebuild without rushing, without taking advantage, without losing sight of the delicate emotional landscape of a city emerging from trauma. And the Kadoories, perhaps more than any other family, had spent there Lives preparing for exactly this moment, the dynasty reborn. The destruction of war had stripped away much of what they built, but it also revealed the strength of what remained, their resilience, their intuition, their capacity to rebuild with calm, deliberate intention, and their quiet understanding that survival is not the opposite of loss. It is what emerges after loss has passed through. Hong Kong was not yet prosperous, not yet stable, not yet whole, but it was alive again, and as the city's lights brightened night after night, the Kadoories knew that their story, and Hong Kong's, was beginning a new chapter, the chapter built not from what they regained, but from what they refused to let the world take from them, their endurance. The years after the war carried a rhythm unlike any Hong Kong had known before, not the urgency of a booming port, nor the silence of occupation, but something gentler, a slow, determined return to life. Recovery did not arrive in a single moment. It came in small gestures, quiet collaborations, and the gradual reweaving of a community that had survived the unimaginable. For the Kadoories, rebuilding Hong Kong was not just a matter of restoring power stations or repairing hotels. It was a matter of restoring confidence, the sense that the city could once again trust its own future, that a city learning to stand again. Hong Kong moved carefully through these early post-war days. Fishermen returned to the water with fewer nets than before. Shopkeepers reopened storefronts missing half their shelves. Children played in streets still marked by the scars of occupation. And families gathered around the soft glow of electric lamps, grateful for something steady in a world still adjusting to peace. Electricity became more than a convenience, that it became a symbol, a reminder that the darkness of war no longer governed daily life. And behind that symbol, almost invisibly, were the Kadoories. Their technicians worked in silence across the city, rewiring cables, repairing systems, and coaxing life back into machines worn thin from years of neglect. There was no ceremony to this work, no announcement. Just steady, patient effort, the kind of effort that holds a city upright when it is too tired to stand on its own. The peninsula reopens. A beacon in a wounded city, the reopening of the peninsula became a turning point. Not because it restored luxury. Luxury felt distant, almost irrelevant in these years, but because it restored dignity. Guests walked into a lobby once scarred by war, now glowing softly under newly restored chandeliers. Musicians played gentle notes that filled the space with warmth. Staff members greeted visitors with a calm assurance that life, despite everything, was beginning again. People who had endured hardship found comfort in its quiet elegance. Travelers returning to Hong Kong felt a kind of reassurance in its familiar walls, and the city itself, still fragile, still healing, seemed to breathe easier with each day the hotel remained open to the Kadoories. The peninsula was more than a business, that it was a message that Hong Kong still had a center of gravity, a place where the past was honored and the future could unfold with grace. Stepping into leadership without seeking power. In the years after the war, many families with influence in Asia attempted to assert their dominance, eager to take advantage of a region reshaped by conflict. But the Kadoories moved differently. They understood that Hong Kong did not need ambition, that it needed stability. They worked quietly with British administrators, offering support where systems lagged. They strengthened ties with Chinese communities, many of whom had lost nearly everything. They provided resources not to expand their empire, but to help restore the city's infrastructure: water, power, sanitation, transport. Their leadership was not loud. It was steady. It was calm. It was deeply rooted in the belief that a city cannot rise unless its people rise with it. Electricity as a lifeline, not a commodity. As demand for power increased, the Kadoories faced a choice. They could raise prices sharply and capitalize on the city's dependence, a choice many corporations in similar conditions made. Instead, they expanded cautiously, ensuring affordability and reliability took precedence over profit. They reinvested earnings into stronger grids, better equipment, and more resilient systems. They maintained transparency with local officials and community leaders, and they built trust, not through promises, but through consistency. Electricity became the quiet heartbeat of Hong Kong's renewal. And the Kadoories, without ever stepping into the spotlight, tended that heartbeat with a care. that felt almost parental. A deeper identity forms as Hong Kong rebuilt itself. The Kadoorie family's identity deepened. They were no longer newcomers, and no longer traders searching for opportunity, and no longer survivors of a world that had forced them into flight. They were stewards, custodians of a city finding its voice again. Their empire was not defined by glamour or spectacle. It was defined by the calm, persistent work of restoring what was broken and strengthening what was fragile. In these years, the foundations of the modern Kadoorie Dynasty took their final shape, not in the power they held, but in the responsibility they accepted. Hong Kong trusted them, and trust, they knew, was the most valuable asset a family could hold. The city's recovery was far from over, but its direction was clear. Light had returned, stability had begun to form, and the Kadoories, patient, deliberate, quietly enduring, were ready for the next chapter of Hong Kong's rise. As the city continued its slow return to life, a new challenge rose quietly across Hong Kong, one that had nothing to do with infrastructure, commerce, or hotels. It emerged not from buildings or broken systems, but from people, from those who had nowhere left to go. In the years after the war, waves of refugees poured into Hong Kong. Some arrived on small boats, drifting across the water with only a few belongings sealed in cloth bundles. Others traveled by foot for days, exhausted, carrying the weight of entire families on their shoulders. Many had escaped famine, political turmoil, or violent transitions on the mainland. All carried stories they rarely spoke aloud. Hong Kong, already fragile in its own recovery, was suddenly faced with a humanitarian test that few cities could endure. Crowded streets grew even denser. Makeshift homes appeared on hillsides. Children wandered markets seeking food. Hospitals strained beneath the sudden increase in need. And amid this unfolding crisis, the Kadoories did something that would define their family name for generations. They stepped forward, quietly, without ceremony, to help. The soft expansion of responsibility. The family had rebuilt much of their infrastructure, but now they turned their attention to rebuilding lives. Unlike many business families who focused narrowly on restoring profits, the Kadoories understood that a city's strength is measured not by its wealth, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. They financed small hospitals, not grandly, but steadily, expanding wards, restoring lost equipment, helping train new nurses and staff. They funded schools for refugee children, understanding that knowledge was a form of shelter that endured long after crises passed. They offered housing assistance to families who had been living in temporary shelters, giving them a chance to step out of survival and into stability. None of these acts were advertised. Most were never publicly acknowledged. But in quiet corners of Hong Kong, where help was needed most, the Kadoories became a steady hand. Land, light, and livelihood. The family recognized that the city's challenges were woven together. A lack of electricity in refugee districts meant unsafe nights. That a lack of stable housing meant communities could not organize or rebuild. But a lack of work meant families remained trapped in cycles of uncertainty. The Kadoories addressed each issue in the same gentle, deliberate manner that had guided them through every chapter of their rise. They extended power lines into neighborhoods that had been overlooked during early reconstruction, places where lanterns still flickered long after. Wealthier districts regained electricity. They invested in construction projects that created employment without exploiting desperation. They allowed sections of their land to be used for temporary housing, helping reduce overcrowding in the most vulnerable areas. In doing so, they were not just shaping a business empire. They were shaping Hong Kong's social landscape, offering stability where none existed, and helping the city absorb its growing population with dignity. The peninsula as a gathering point. Once more as the city healed, the Peninsula Hotel began serving a new purpose. It was no longer simply a space of luxury. It became a meeting ground for relief organizations, diplomats, and community leaders. Quiet conversations took place in its restored suites. Plans for refugee assistance were discussed in its calm, lamplit lounges. Hopeful ideas were exchanged where only despair had sat during the occupation. The hotel, once a symbol of elegance, became a symbol of restoration. A reminder that even the most wounded spaces can become centers of renewal when treated with care. A dynasty rooted in humanity. By stepping into humanitarian efforts, The Kadoories revealed something that many families of great wealth never discover. That influence means little unless it improves the lives of those who have none. Their actions were not strategic. They were not political. They were simply guided by a principle passed quietly through generations. That survival becomes meaningful only when it is shared. Hong Kong was still fragile, its future still uncertain, but its spirit, the collective heartbeat of a population rebuilding from sorrow, grew stronger with each gesture of compassion. And in those years, the Kadoorie Dynasty evolved from a family of merchants into something deeper, caretakers of a city still learning how to live again. The next chapter of their story would not only be about rebuilding wealth, but about shaping Hong Kong into the modern powerhouse it would one day become. Chapter 5. A City Ascends, the Kadoories, and the Making of Modern Hong Kong. By the 1950s, the scars of war had not disappeared, but they had faded into the background of a city moving toward a new identity. Hong Kong was no longer merely recovering. It was transforming, step by gentle step, into a place unlike any other in Asia. A crossroads of cultures, a sanctuary for the displaced, a hub of commerce rising from the quiet determination of its people. And at the center of this transformation, still calm, still steady, were the Kadoories. Their work in electricity, hospitality, and community rebuilding had woven them deeply into the city's emerging structure. What they had once built for survival was now becoming essential to Hong Kong's future, a booming city in need of power as factories opened in Kowloon and new residential areas expanded across the hillsides. Demand for electricity surged. Lights burned later into the night. Machines hummed in workshops that produced goods for export. Families cooked, studied, and gathered beneath steady bulbs that no longer flickered with uncertainty. Electricity had become the invisible bloodstream of Hong Kong, a silent force connecting homes, businesses, and entire districts. The Kadoories expanded Hong Kong Electric with the same gentle patience that defined every phase of their rise. They built new facilities not for show, but for longevity. They reinforced old lines to withstand storms. They studied growing neighborhoods to assess need before demand overwhelmed supply to them. Electricity was not a commodity. It was a responsibility, a promise that no family, no matter how modest, should be forced into darkness again. The peninsula becomes a global icon. As Hong Kong grew, the peninsula evolved alongside it. The hotel, once a wounded shell after wartime occupation, regained its quiet confidence. Its lobby glowed with warm lamplight, its rooms filled with travelers drawn to the city's rising energy. Its famous fleet of green Rolls-Royces became symbols of a new era, a blend of elegance and resilience unique to Hong Kong. World leaders, bankers, diplomats, artists, they all passed through its doors, stepping into an atmosphere shaped by calm luxury rather than extravagance. And in its quiet spaces, decisions were made that would shape trade, politics, and commerce throughout Asia. But beneath the polished marble and soft piano notes, the hotel still held the essence of the family who rebuilt it, steady, composed, grounded. Hong Kong begins to find its voice. The influx of refugees brought more than hardship. It brought talent, creativity, and ambition. Entrepreneurs launched small businesses, textile factories multiplied, shipping companies expanded operations as goods flowed in and out of the harbor in growing volumes. By providing power, stability, and infrastructure, the Kadoories helped turn this potential into momentum. Hong Kong, once fragile, now pulsed with life. It wasn't just rising, it was ascending. The Kadoories' influence deepens, softly, quietly. As their businesses expanded, the family's presence became a constant across the city. They supported hospitals that treated the sick during epidemics. They financed schools for children who had arrived with nothing. They developed housing programs that offered stability to families who had lost their homes. But they did all of this without stepping into political debates, without claiming credit, without positioning themselves as rulers of the city they helped rebuild. Their influence flowed through Hong Kong the way electricity did, quietly, invisibly. Essential. A dynasty defined by stability, not poverty. Business families rise through ambition. The Kadoories rose through steadiness. While others chased expansion, they prioritized resilience. While others sought prestige, they chose responsibility. While others gambled with markets, They built systems that could endure decades of unpredictable change. By the end of the 1950s, the family had become something rare in Asia, a dynasty trusted not for its wealth, but for its consistency. Hong Kong looked toward the future with increasing confidence. Confidence built on foundations the Kadoories had spent years shaping with quiet hands. The next decades would go on to bring prosperity, challenges, political complexities, and historic transitions. But as the city prepared to face each new era, it did so with the stability of a family whose influence had become interwoven with its very identity. The dynasty that did not rule Hong Kong, but helped Hong Kong learn how to stand. As the 1960s approached, Hong Kong began entering a period many would one day call its golden age, a time when the city learned not just to survive or recover, but to thrive. The once fragile colony evolved into a bustling hub of manufacturing, finance, and culture, its skyline stretching higher each year, its streets growing more alive with possibility. And beneath this visible ascent, the Kadoories continued their quiet work, strengthening systems, refining infrastructure, and providing the stability a rising city so desperately needed. Electricity becomes the pulse of a modern economy. Factories expanded into Kowloon and beyond, filling vast rooms with the hum of sewing machines and the rhythmic clatter of production lines. These workshops powered a new generation of exports: textiles, electronics, plastics, goods that carried the words "Made in Hong Kong" to markets around the world. But none of this was possible without electricity. Power had become the invisible backbone of Hong Kong's transformation, and the Kadoories treated it as a public trust. They upgraded power stations with technologies far ahead of what other colonies used. They reinforced grid networks to withstand storms and surges. They extended service into new districts as families moved into hillside apartments and growing suburbs. For the Kadoories, providing electricity was not an act of expansion, it was an act of caretaking. Hong Kong was growing quickly, but it needed a steady heartbeat, and the family ensured that heartbeat never faltered. A relationship with the city, rooted in mutual dependence. By now, the Kadoories' role in Hong Kong had evolved beyond business. They had become intertwined with the city's identity in ways both practical and emotional. People depended on their electricity to cook dinner each night. Children studied under the soft glow of lamps powered by their grids. Workers traveled through well-lit streets on their way home. Factories met global demand because their machines never fell silent. In turn, the Kadoories depended on Hong Kong, on its resilience, its industriousness, its willingness to embrace change. They understood that their fate and the cities were bound together, each shaping the destiny of the other. This mutual dependence created a bond not easily broken. Hospitality as a cultural anchor. The peninsula's growing legacy. As Hong Kong flourished, the peninsula evolved into more than a hotel. It became a gathering place for the city's emerging elite, a refuge for travelers seeking calm in a rapidly changing region, and a symbol of Hong Kong's newfound sophistication. Diplomats negotiated agreements beneath its chandeliers. Celebrities arrived through its grand entrance in quiet procession. Families celebrated milestones in its elegant dining rooms. Yet despite its luxury, the peninsula remained rooted in a spirit of gentleness, a reflection of the family who guided it. Its service was calm, its atmosphere warm, its presence understated. It offered something many visitors did not expect in a booming city: a sense of stillness. And this stillness became part of Hong Kong's charm, a reminder that even in the rush of progress, there was a place where time seemed to slow. Community commitments that deepened with each passing year as economic growth spread through the colony. The Kadoories continued supporting the communities that had supported them. Schools in working-class neighborhoods expanded through their funding. Hospitals added new wings with their quiet backing. Cultural programs received grants aimed at preserving Hong Kong's unique blend of East and West. Unlike many business families who used philanthropy for visibility, the Kadoories practiced it with humility. Never as spectacle, always as service. The people of Hong Kong began to see them less as magnates and more as guardians of the city's well-being. Navigating political sensitivities with absolute neutrality. These decades were also defined by increasing geopolitical complexity. China was undergoing dramatic internal shifts. Britain's colonial influence was evolving. Tensions simmered across Asia. But through all of this, the Kadoories maintained a principle that shaped their longevity. Never become political, not publicly, not privately, not strategically. Their neutrality was not avoidance. It was survival. It allowed them to operate through empires, occupations, transitions, and reforms without becoming entangled in conflicts that toppled others. They remained steady, calm, focused only on service, community, and long-term stability. A dynasty that grew through restraint, not ambition. By the end of the 1960s, the Kadoories had achieved what few families in the world ever do. They built influence without force. They built wealth without spectacle. They built trust without demanding it. They shaped a city without trying to own it. Hong Kong was no longer the wounded place they had returned to after the war. It was strong, confident, full of life, and much of that life flowed, quietly and consistently, through the systems they had spent decades constructing. A dynasty had not risen from bold ambition, but from gentle, disciplined resilience. By the 1970s and 1980s, Hong Kong had become something extraordinary, a city unbound by its geography, unrestrained by its past, and untouched by the doubts that once clouded its early existence. Towers rose where fishing boats once gathered. Neon glowed where kerosene lamps once flickered. Financial markets thrived where simple trade houses once stood. And through this entire transformation, the Kadoories remained what they had always been: quiet architects of stability. They were not at the forefront of Hong Kong's noise, its glamour, or its explosive growth. They were beneath it, providing the systems that allowed the noise to rise, the glamour to shine, the growth to accelerate. Electricity still flowed through cables they had laid decades earlier. The peninsula still welcomed guests with its steady, unchanging elegance. And their businesses continued to expand with the same gentle pace that had defined their philosophy from the beginning. Hong Kong approaches a historic transition as the 20th century neared its final stretch. Conversations in the city began to shift. Whispers of change spread softly at first. Discussions about sovereignty, negotiations between London and Beijing, debates in cafes and offices about what Hong Kong's future might hold. Some residents feared uncertainty. Others anticipated opportunity. Most simply waited, knowing that the world was preparing to tilt once more. The Kadoories, however, did not fear this transition. They had survived the fall of the Ottoman Empire. They had adapted under British colonial rule. They had endured Japanese occupation. They had rebuilt after the war. And now, standing at the edge of another chapter, they approached the future with the same quiet resilience that had carried them across continents, preparing without alarm, adapting without resistance. As negotiations progressed toward Hong Kong's 1997 return to China, businesses across the city responded in different ways. Some withdrew capital. Others relocated headquarters. Many braced for impact. But the Kadoories did something different. They observed, they listened, and they prepared gently, with a calm acceptance that political landscapes shift. But communities endure. They deepen relationships with local partners. They strengthen communication with Chinese officials. They expanded operations in ways that served both Hong Kong and the mainland. And they reinforced their electricity and hotel infrastructure to withstand any period of transition. Their neutrality, once simply a survival tactic, now became a bridge, connecting old systems with new ones, foreign investors with local confidence. Hong Kong's past with its uncertain future, a legacy built on light. By this period, Hong Kong Electric, under the Kadoories' steady hand, was powering most of the city. Towers that pierced the sky at night glowed because of the grids they maintained. Factories that produced goods for global markets thrived because their machines never slept. Homes across Hong Kong Island lived in rhythms shaped by the dependable hum of Kadoorie power. Electricity had become more than infrastructure. It had become a symbol of continuity, a promise that no matter how the political winds shifted, Hong Kong would remain illuminated. This symbolism carried emotional weight. In moments of doubt, people looked to the strength of institutions they trusted. And among those, the Kadoories stood quietly, offering stability without words, reassurance without declarations. The peninsula in a changing world. As the years passed, the peninsula transformed once more, not into something new, but into a reminder of what Hong Kong had always been capable of. Its polished floors reflected the city's growth. Its calm interiors softened the rush of the world outside. Its windows framed a skyline rising higher and sharper each year. Diplomats met here before historic agreements. Journalists stayed here during uncertain negotiations, and families visited for the simple comfort of knowing that some things, even in changing times, remained steady. The peninsula did not resist the future that it embraced it quietly, just as the family who owned it did, a dynasty rooted not in power, but in permanence. As Hong Kong approached its return to China, the Kadoories stood not as political figures nor as negotiators, but as living proof of something rare, that a family can survive every shift in power if they build their identity not on dominance, but on endurance. Their businesses were stable, their reputation was trusted, their neutrality was respected by every side, and their role in the city's history had become undeniable, woven into its infrastructure, its recovery, its ascent. They did not fear the 1997 transition because they understood what few others did. Empires rise and fall, governments shift and transform, but the systems quietly shaping everyday life, light, water, shelter, community, endure, and so do the people who dedicate themselves to these systems. As the century approached its end, Hong Kong stood at the edge of change once again. But this time, it did so with a confidence rooted not in political stability, but in the foundations built by families like the Kadoories. Families who had turned resilience into legacy, and legacy into permanence. The dynasty once made of refugees had become the quiet pillar of an entire city. Chapter 6. The handover approaches. The Kadoories face Hong Kong's most defining transition. As the final decades of the 20th century unfolded, Hong Kong entered a period of quiet anticipation, a long, gentle inhale before a moment that would reshape its identity forever. The streets buzzed with activity as always. Ferries drifted across the harbor in their steady rhythm, and neon lights shimmered softly against the water at night. Yet beneath this familiar surface, a subtle tension lingered, not fear, not alarm, just an awareness that the city was approaching a threshold no generation before had crossed. In quieter neighborhoods, conversations turned to the future. Shopkeepers wondered how business might change. Families spoke softly about what 1997 might bring. Office workers scanned newspapers for signs of reassurance, and children, unaware of the significance, watched their parents navigate this strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. For many, the transition felt unpredictable. For the Kadoories, it felt familiar that a family who had survived every shift before the handover was not. The first monumental change the family had witnessed. They had watched empires dissolve. They had adapted to new rulers, new laws, new currencies. They had rebuilt their lives across continents and survived wars that erased entire systems. When Hong Kong prepared to move from British rule to Chinese sovereignty, the Kadoories did not meet the moment with fear. They met it with perspective. They understood what others struggled to accept. Politics may change abruptly, but daily life, the quiet infrastructure that supports a city, continues across eras. Electricity still needed to flow, homes still needed light, hotels still needed to welcome guests, businesses still needed stability, and communities still needed compassion. These were the areas where the family had built their identity, and these were the areas they would continue to protect. Stability through soft presence. In the years leading up to the handover, the Kadoories moved with deliberate, gentle intention. There were no bold declarations, no headlines, no public assurances. Only quiet, consistent actions. They strengthened Hong Kong Electric's reserves, ensuring the grid would remain stable regardless of political change. They reinforced partnerships with Chinese officials, maintaining a respectful neutrality that transcended political boundaries. They expanded their hospitality operations, preparing the peninsula to remain a sanctuary no matter what the future held. They continued community support initiatives, understanding that a population's emotional stability is just as important as its economic stability. Their presence became something the city could lean on, not loudly, but steadily. A calm center in a moment defined by uncertainty. The city watches the horizon. By the mid-1990s, Hong Kong felt suspended between two identities, part of Britain, yet undeniably tied to China. Tower cranes dotted the skyline as construction soared. The stock market pulsed with confidence. And yet, beneath the city's momentum, a quiet question remained. What happens next? People expected answers from governments, not families. And yet, strangely, many found comfort in the Kadoorie name, a name associated not with political authority, but with endurance. The family's refusal to take sides, their commitment to public service, their steady stewardship of essential infrastructure. All of it reassured a population searching for stability, that a philosophy that prepared them for transition. The Kadoories had always lived by a principle that seemed almost simple: adapt without resistance and serve without expectation. This principle allowed them to survive exile, navigate colonial politics, rebuild after occupation, and guide Hong Kong through its post-war rebirth. And now, it carried them toward the handover with a clarity that many lacked. They did not view 1997 as an end. They viewed it as a continuation. Another chapter in the long story of a city that had always learned how to adapt. The weight of legacy. As Hong Kong approached its defining moment, the family understood something profound. Their true legacy was not electricity, not hotels, not wealth. It was trust, earned over decades of quiet resilience, quiet service, quiet presence, and trust, they knew, would carry the city far beyond the date marked on its calendars. The peninsula prepared to dim its lights for a single historic night. Hong Kong Electric prepared to keep the city glowing through the transition. And the Kadoories prepared to watch history unfold, not as rulers, not as spectators, but as guardians of a continuity they had spent generations nurturing. Hong Kong was stepping into a new era, and the family who once arrived with nothing had become one of the few constants the city could rely on as it crossed the threshold. As the final hours of June 30th, 1997 drifted across Hong Kong, the city felt wrapped in a kind of quiet unlike anything it had experienced before. The harbor shimmered beneath a soft haze. Ferries eased through the water with deliberate slowness, and the skyline, tall, bright, confident, stood suspended between two histories. People gathered in living rooms, on rooftops, beside radios, or along the waterfront, waiting for midnight. Not anxiously, but with the reflective stillness of a population aware that they were witnessing a moment that would echo far beyond their own lifetimes. The streets were calm. The hotels were calm. Even the air itself seemed to move gently, as though respecting the significance of the night. And within this atmosphere, the Kadoories prepared themselves not as business owners or public figures, but as caretakers of continuity, ensuring that the essential rhythms of the city would remain untouched as its flag changed above them. Midnight in Hong Kong. A transition without a flicker. When the clock moved toward 12, a soft hush fell over the harbor. Television screens across the city displayed the final minutes of British administration. Crowds gathered quietly at the convention center. And in homes across Hong Kong, lights remained steady, glowing with the same soft reliability that had defined decades of Kadoorie stewardship for the family. Electricity that night carried a symbolism deeper than utility. It represented reassurance, the promise, the subtle way of telling the people of Hong Kong that their daily life, the gentle flow of light through their windows, would not be disrupted by political ceremony. And as the moment arrived, as sovereignty shifted from Britain to China, the city did not dim, the lights did not flicker, the harbor did not fall dark. Hong Kong passed through one of the most significant transitions in modern history with complete calm, a calm the Kadoories helped create. The peninsula watches over the moment across the water. The Peninsula Hotel stood in its familiar elegance, quiet, observant, timeless. Inside its suites, diplomats gathered in low-voiced conversations. Business leaders watched the ceremony with composed expressions. Families staying in the hotel felt a strange comfort, as if the building itself offered a soft assurance that Hong Kong would continue to stand strong. The peninsula had witnessed wars, occupation, rebirth, and prosperity. Now it witnessed the handover, a moment it absorbed with the same poise it carried through every era. The hotel did not celebrate, that it did not mourn, it simply remained present, steady, dignified, enduring, much like the family behind it. Why the Kadoories endured when others could not. In the days before and after the handover, many corporations worried about the future. Some scaled back investments. Others relocated. Foreign executives spoke of uncertainty. But the Kadoories stayed, without hesitation, without condition. Their survival was rooted not in influence, but in adaptability. not in allegiance, but in neutrality, not in asserting power, but in supporting the systems that allowed a city to rise. Their philosophy had carried them across continents and through eras, and now it carried them into a Hong Kong led by a new government, but driven by the same human needs they had served for decades: electricity, shelter, stability, continuity. These were not political. They were essential that a new relationship with China begins in the years following the handover. The Kadoories continued operating with the same quiet constancy that defined their past. They respected new leadership without aligning themselves with it. They deepened their relationships with mainland partners without becoming dependent on them. And they protected Hong Kong Electric and the peninsula with an attentiveness that transcended politics. Their neutrality, once a response to survival, became a bridge between two worlds, a global Hong Kong and a rising China. They did not try to shape the political future. They simply ensured the city had the infrastructure to face it. And in doing so, they strengthened their legacy. Hong Kong awakens into its new reality months after the handover. Life settled into a familiar rhythm. The stock market moved with the same intensity as before, streets filled with the same crowds. Lights flickered on each evening as reliably as ever. People realized something simple, but deeply comforting. The essence of the city had not changed. Its heartbeat remained steady. Its future, though uncertain at times, still unfolded with possibility. And behind that steadiness, behind the quiet continuity of daily life, was a dynasty that had weathered every chapter of Hong Kong's history, a family who had learned how to endure not by resisting change, but by adapting gently to it. And as the new century approached, the Kadoories prepared to guide Hong Kong through yet another era, not as rulers, not as symbols, but as quiet custodians of a city they had helped illuminate for more than 100 years. As the 21st century approached, Hong Kong entered a period defined not by singular events, but by a gentle, continuous evolution. The city adjusted to its new political reality with the same adaptability that had always shaped its character. Businesses continued to grow. Families continued to build their lives. The skyline stretched higher with each passing year. And through it all, the quiet hum of electricity, steady, reliable, unwavering, carried the city into its next era. Behind that hum was the same family who had arrived with nothing more than resilience and a willingness to begin again. The Kadoories had survived the fall of empires, the violence of war, the uncertainties of transition. And now, they found themselves guiding Hong Kong into a century defined less by crisis and more by complexity. Resilience as a legacy in these years, the family's influence was not loud. It did not dominate headlines or public ceremonies. Instead, it appeared in quieter spaces, in the systems that supported the city's needs. Hong Kong Electric continued delivering power to millions, its reliability becoming a point of pride in a world where infrastructure often faltered under pressure. The peninsula remained a sanctuary of calm elegance, its doors opening to travelers visiting a city that had become one of the world's financial capitals. Community programs the family supported grew into lifelines for those who felt the pressures of urban life most intensely. The Kadoories did not seek to expand aggressively. They sought to endure thoughtfully. Their philosophy remained the same: protect what matters, strengthen what breaks. Adapt before change becomes crisis. A family rooted in the future, without forgetting the past. Unlike many dynasties that lose their identity over generations, the Kadoories carried their history forward with remarkable gentleness. They did not forget Baghdad, where their journey began. They did not forget Bombay, where they learned resilience. They did not forget Shanghai, where they first understood the potential of Asia. And they did not forget Hong Kong, the city that allowed them to become whole again. This memory shaped their decisions. It softened their approach. It reminded them that their greatest fortune was not wealth, but the ability to survive with dignity, weathering the global winds as global markets fluctuated, as political dynamics shifted across Asia, and as new uncertainties emerged. The Kadoories remained calm. They had lived through greater storms than these. They understood that cities, like families, experience seasons, some bright, some difficult, all temporary. Their focus stayed on the essentials: electricity strong enough to power a global financial hub, hotels refined enough to anchor the city's identity, community efforts compassionate enough to ease hardship, and a presence steady enough to reassure a population moving through unfamiliar times. Why the dynasty endured in a city known for rapid change, the Kadoories became something rare, an unbroken line of continuity. They endured because they never attempted to control Hong Kong. They endured because they adapted without fear. They endured because they offered what the city needed most: stability without dominance, service without spectacle, and influence without force. Many families rose through ambition. The Kadoories rose through responsibility. Their legacy became woven not into politics, but into experience. The simple act of turning on a light, walking through a hotel lobby, or trusting that tomorrow would unfold with the same quiet consistency as today, that a dynasty that outlived every empire around it. By the time the world entered the new millennium, one truth had become clear: empires fall, governments change, economies expand and contract, but resilience, real resilience, survives everything. The Kadoories were no longer refugees. They were the quiet custodians of a city they helped build, illuminate, and guide through every transformation. And as Hong Kong continued to evolve, facing challenges, opportunities, and unknowns, the family remained what they had always been: present, steady, enduring. That a dynasty not defined by power, but by permanence. Chapter 7. A New Century. The Kadoories navigate a rapidly changing Hong Kong. The early 2000s settled over Hong Kong with a different kind of energy. Not the uncertainty of war, not the anticipation of political transition, but the quiet hum of a city stepping fully into the modern world. Towers stretched skyward, glass and steel reflecting a harbor that had become one of the busiest on Earth. Neon gave way to LED, ferries grew faster, and the city that once struggled to rebuild now pulsed with global ambition. And yet, beneath this confident rhythm, Hong Kong faced new challenges. Challenges not born from conflict, but from the weight of rapid transformation. Technological change accelerated, global markets tightened and expanded in unpredictable patterns. The city's identity, once defined by trade and colonial history, began shifting toward finance, innovation, and cultural influence. For many, the pace felt overwhelming. For the Kadoories, it felt familiar. They had always lived in the spaces between eras, and now, once again, they found themselves guiding Hong Kong through a transition not marked on any calendar, but unfolding quietly in the lives of its people. That a dynasty enters the digital age. Hong Kong electric transformed as the city modernized. The grids became smarter. Energy demands grew more complex. The need for cleaner, more efficient power rose with urgency. The Kadoories embraced this new era with the same patience that had carried them since the 1800s. They studied new technologies deliberately. They invested cautiously but consistently. They adapted the company's infrastructure, not to chase innovation, but to integrate it thoughtfully. Their goal was not to lead the race, but to ensure the city never fell behind. In meeting rooms filled with softly humming projectors, engineers reviewed plans for renewable integration, advanced substations, and resilient grid systems. And always, at the center of these conversations, the Kadoories asked the same guiding question: how do we protect the city from uncertainty? Not, how do we maximize profit? Not, how do we outpace competitors? Their mission remained unchanged: endurance, stability, continuity. The peninsula reinvents elegance across the harbor. The peninsula experienced its own transformation. The world's travelers had changed. New wealth from mainland China arrived in growing numbers. Globalization shaped expectations. Digital communication connected cultures in ways unimaginable a generation before. But the hotel remained a sanctuary, not by resisting change, but by absorbing it gently. New suites were added with modern amenities, yet designed with the same calming atmosphere that defined its heritage. Art installations appeared in quiet hallways, blending contemporary creativity with timeless elegance. Technology was introduced subtly, never disrupting the soft flow of the guest experience. And through every change, the peninsula retained its soul, a place where time slowed, where calm overcame noise, where Hong Kong's most enduring qualities found expression in light, space, and hospitality. The family's growing role in conservation. As the century progressed, the Kadoories expanded their focus beyond business. they turned increasingly toward environmental stewardship, a cause rooted in their long-standing respect for land and community. They supported wildlife sanctuaries in remote parts of Hong Kong. They invested in agricultural development projects that helped struggling farmers. They funded conservation programs protecting endangered species and fragile ecosystems. Their philanthropy was not loud.it did. Not seek headlines.it was an extension of their core belief that those who have survived so much must help protect the world that allowed them to endure. A city in transition, a family watching gently. Hong Kong moved into the new century with momentum, but also with tension beneath the surface. Housing pressures grew. Economic inequality widened. Questions about the city's political future resurfaced in new forms. Younger generations wrestled with identity, opportunity, and belonging. The Kadoories did not attempt to influence these complexities. They maintained the same soft neutrality that had protected them for more than a century. Their role, as always, was to provide stability where they could, and silence where their voice was not needed. What mattered most was that lights continued to shine in every district, that hotels welcomed guests into calm spaces, that the city still had anchors strong enough to withstand turbulence. The dynasty still defined by quiet strength. By the end of the decade, one truth was clear. The Kadoories were no longer simply a business family. They had become part of Hong Kong's emotional infrastructure, a symbol of consistency in a world that shifted faster each year. Their legacy was not in history books or monuments. It lived in the routines of everyday people, in the light that greeted them when they returned home at night, in the confidence they felt walking through a city that never fully dimmed. That a family once shaped by exile was now helping guide a global metropolis into the future. And as Hong Kong continued to transform, the Kadoories prepared, once again, to move with it, quietly, calmly, without ever needing to be seen. The early 2000s brought Hong Kong into a world far more interconnected and far more fragile than anything the city had known before. Global markets were now linked by invisible threads of capital and information. Technology blurred borders. Financial shocks in distant countries rippled through trading floors and central within hours. And for the first time in its history, Hong Kong's challenges were shaped not only by local forces, but by the unpredictable movements of an entire planet. The city still glittered at night, still carried the confident pulse of commerce, still thrived as a gateway between China and the world. But beneath this vitality ran a new, quiet anxiety. The awareness that the forces shaping life were now larger, faster, and less predictable than ever before. And through this complex environment, the Kadoories navigated with the same softness and restraint that had defined their dynasty for generations. That a family that refused to rush as competitors expanded aggressively, chasing digital ventures and volatile markets. The Kadoories chose a slower path, not out of caution, but out of discipline. They strengthened Hong Kong Electric's long-term reliability rather than chasing short-term returns. They invested in modernization without sacrificing stability. They expanded carefully into renewable energy, not as a trend, but as a responsibility. And they prepared their systems quietly for potential shocks, economic, political, or environmental. Their approach reflected a truth they had learned through history. Fast growth can crumble, steady growth endures. And as other corporations rose and fell with global cycles, the Kadoories remained anchored, unshaken, deliberate. The peninsula in a changing luxury world. The hospitality world shifted dramatically during this time. Wealth became younger, more mobile, more technologically connected. Expectations for experiences, not just accommodations, grew. Travelers wanted spaces that felt personal, meaningful, emotionally grounding. The peninsula responded not by reinventing itself, but by refining its essence. Rooms integrated technology quietly, screens that dimmed softly into the background, controls designed to feel intuitive rather than intrusive. Restaurants blended tradition with contemporary tastes, preserving the gentle elegance that defined the hotel's character. Staff trained in subtle forms of hospitality, where service felt warm, effortless, almost invisible. And through these changes, the peninsula maintained its identity as a sanctuary, a place where guests could escape the noise of a city that never paused. Environmental stewardship becomes a pillar as climate concerns grew worldwide. The Kadoories expanded their environmental commitments with unusual dedication, not as branding, not as strategy, but as philosophy. They funded endangered species programs in remote regions. They invested in sustainable farming innovations. They strengthened ecological research centers that studied biodiversity. They worked quietly with conservationists who viewed the natural world not as scenery, but as something fragile and irreplaceable. Their philanthropy reflected a simple truth whispered through the generations. A family that has known displacement understands the value of protecting what cannot be replaced. Hong Kong's economic shifts test the city's stability. The early 2000s were also marked by financial turbulence, global recessions, market downturns, shifting currencies. Each wave hit Hong Kong with sudden intensity. Banks tightened, businesses closed, families grew anxious. But the electricity grid stayed strong, the lights stayed on. The systems the Kadoories built held firm. This reliability offered a sense of normalcy the city needed. A reminder that no matter how markets moved, the core of daily life remained intact. And for many, this mattered more than any political reassurance could. Neutrality as a form of wisdom through all these changes. The family never entered public debates. They never attempted to sway the direction of governance. They never allowed themselves to become symbols of any movement. Their neutrality did not come from disinterest. It came from experience. They had learned over centuries that the world shifts in ways no individual can predict, that influence built on politics is fragile, and that true longevity comes from serving the city itself, not the structures that govern it. A dynasty that moves with time, not against it. By the end of this period, one could look at Hong Kong and see a place shaped by innovation, ambition, and extraordinary momentum. But beneath the surface, quiet as a hum through underground cables, steady as lamplight in a narrow apartment window, was the influence of the Kadoories. A family who learned to endure by adjusting gently, building slowly, and trusting that longevity grows not from force, but from balance. They were no longer just survivors of history. They were custodians of continuity in a world that changed faster each year. And as Hong Kong prepared to enter yet another unfamiliar era, the family stood ready once again, not to lead loudly, but to guide quietly. As the 2000s unfolded, Hong Kong entered a period shaped not by catastrophic events or dramatic transitions, but by something subtler, a growing awareness that the world was becoming more unpredictable, more interconnected, and more fragile than anyone had expected. Globalization brought opportunity, but also instability. Technology expanded horizons, but also increased pressure. Markets surged upward and spiraled downward with sudden and bewildering speed. For many families, this era felt like walking across shifting ground. Each step uncertain, each decision weighed against unseen forces. But for the Kadoories, this environment felt strangely familiar. They had always lived in the spaces where certainty faltered. They had always built their identity on the ability to move with time rather than resist it. And now, that philosophy became their greatest strength, the quiet reassurance of a steady light throughout this decade. Hong Kong Electric continued to do something remarkably simple and remarkably powerful. It never failed. No blackout of significance, no disruption that shook the city's confidence, no instability that suggested the infrastructure might be vulnerable. In a world where financial systems wavered and political alliances shifted, the steady flow of electricity became a form of emotional stability for millions. People came home each night. Lights that turned on without hesitation. Factories relied on machines that never fell silent. Hospitals ran equipment that remained dependable in moments when every second mattered. This reliability became part of Hong Kong's psychological foundation, a sense that beneath all the uncertainty, something remained steady. And though few spoke of it openly, many understood that the Kadoories were part of that steadiness. The peninsula as a mirror of Hong Kong's soul. During this period, the peninsula evolved into a symbolic space, a place that reflected Hong Kong's quiet resilience. Business travelers arrived seeking stability amid turbulent markets. Artists found inspiration in its calm interior spaces. Diplomats met in its discreet lounges, far from the noise of the outside world. And families visited not for luxury alone, but for the reassurance of a place that seemed untouched by the chaos beyond the harbor. The hotel did not change dramatically, it refined itself gently. New technologies hidden behind timeless design. New services layered over familiar warmth. New visitors welcomed with the same calm grace that had defined its spirit for nearly a century. In a city that reinvented itself every few years, the peninsula remained anchored a growing disconnection in the city and the family's response. Yet even as Hong Kong flourished, a sense of emotional distance began to emerge. The pace of life quickened. Work hours stretched longer. The pressure to succeed intensified. And for many, the city's momentum felt more like a tide pulling them forward than a path they chose. The Kadoories sensed this tension, not through politics, but through the quiet conversations they had with community leaders, with local residents, with the people whose lives were supported by their infrastructure. In response, they expanded their philanthropic focus, supporting mental health initiatives, funding programs for marginalized youth, investing in community gardens, and strengthening educational opportunities in neighborhoods often overlooked by the city's economic boom. It was never announced as a formal strategy. It was simply an extension of their identity, a belief that prosperity without well-being is fragile. A family known not for wealth, but for calm. During this time, an interesting transformation occurred. The Kadoories were no longer primarily viewed as business figures or hotel magnates or power providers. They became known, quietly and intuitively, as a source of calm. People trusted them in ways that felt almost familial, not because they were rich, not because they were influential, but because they had been present through every chapter of Hong Kong's vulnerability and growth. They had never left. They had never exploited instability. They had never betrayed their neutrality. They had never acted out of panic or greed. Their constancy became a kind of emotional infrastructure, just as essential, for many, as the electricity that lit their homes. Endurance transforming into legacy as the decade closed and Hong Kong prepared to enter yet another period of change. The Kadoories understood something profound. Their dynasty's greatest achievement was not the businesses they built, nor the wealth they accumulated, nor the influence they quietly held. It was the trust they earned, the deep, quiet trust of a city that had grown under their steady presence. And now, as the world moved forward into increasingly unpredictable times, that trust would become the foundation for everything that followed. For Hong Kong, and for the family who had helped shape it, the next chapters would not be defined by certainty, but by how gently they endured whatever came next. And the Kadoories, as always, were prepared. Chapter 8. Storms of a New Era. The Kadoories faced the pressures of a changing Hong Kong. As Hong Kong moved into the 2010s, the city entered a period defined not by destruction or war, but by pressures far quieter, far more complex, and, in many ways, far more difficult to navigate. The skyline glowed brighter than ever. The harbor moved with elegant efficiency. The city's reputation as a global financial center stood firm. On the surface, Hong Kong had never looked stronger, but beneath the lights, beneath the hum of ferries and the rush of commuters, a different kind of tension began to gather, a tension woven from identity, aspiration, and generational change. Where earlier eras were shaped by external forces, this era was shaped from within. And once again, the Kadoories found themselves witnessing, quietly, attentively, a city shifting its weight in unpredictable ways. A city pulled in two directions. Hong Kong had always lived between worlds, but now, the distance between those worlds felt heavier. Younger generations questioned what the city should become. Older generations held tightly to what it had been. Businesses embraced opportunity, while families worried about inequality and housing they could no longer afford. Voices grew louder. Expectations diverged. Paths that once ran parallel began to pull apart. It was not conflict in the traditional sense. It was something more delicate, a quiet friction between hope and uncertainty, between belonging and change. For the Kadoories, who had survived eras shaped by upheaval, this moment required a different kind of resilience, not endurance of crisis, but endurance of complexity. The role of a quiet dynasty in a restless city during these years, the Kadoories held tightly to the philosophy that had carried them through decades of volatility. Remain steady, remain neutral, remain useful. They did not step into political conversations. They did not align themselves with any movement. they did not allow their name to be drawn into public debate. Instead, they asked themselves a simple question: how do we support the city without disturbing its balance? And the answers came slowly, softly, without fanfare. They strengthened Hong Kong Electric's grids even further, ensuring that no matter how difficult the years became, Hong Kong's nights would not fall into darkness. They expanded community investment programs, focusing on education, mental health, and opportunities for young people facing an increasingly competitive world. And they preserved the peninsula's atmosphere of tranquility, a place where, even amid public tension, guests found a space. Untouched by turmoil, the peninsula threw a new lens as the world outside grew noisier. The hotel became something different from what it had once been. It was no longer simply a landmark of luxury. It became a symbol of continuity, the calm center of a city moving through emotional storms. Its hallways remained softly lit. Its staff moved with quiet professionalism. Its windows framed a skyline that seemed to shift each year, yet somehow always returned to familiar patterns of light. People came not only for rest, but for reassurance. A reminder that parts of Hong Kong remained steady even when the atmosphere outside felt heavy with change. The family's growing commitment to healing, not influence. The Kadoories had lived long enough to understand that every city carries emotional cycles, times of unity, times of division, times of reflection, and so they embraced a role that few families with wealth ever choose: the role of quiet healers. They directed resources toward programs that addressed the invisible fractures beneath society's surface: families under stress, students facing pressure, communities struggling with rising costs. Their philanthropy was not reactive, it was preventative, gentle efforts to soften the edges of a city moving through difficult questions. This was not a strategy. It was an instinct that a family shaped by displacement understands the fragility of belonging. That a dynasty defined by listening. Throughout this period, the Kadoories spent more time listening than ever before, listening to engineers explaining future energy needs, listening to social workers describing pressure on young families, listening to cultural leaders who feared Hong Kong's identity was slipping away, listening to elderly residents who remembered a quieter, simpler time. These conversations did not lead the family toward power, they led them toward purpose. And through these reflections, the Kadoories recognized something important: Hong Kong's future would not be shaped by force but by empathy, by systems that protect people through uncertainty, not systems that demand loyalty. Standing still in a city that never stops. As the decade progressed, Hong Kong continued to change in ways impossible to predict. Some changes were hopeful, some were painful. Many were simply part of the long arc of a city discovering what it wanted to become. But through every shift, every tension, every quiet moment of unease, one constant remained: the Kadoories stayed, not as rulers, not as commentators, not as influencers, but as the same steady presence they had always been. A refuge of continuity in a city learning how to navigate the weight of its own story. And as Hong Kong moved toward yet another unfamiliar horizon, the family prepared, once again, to guide gently, observe quietly, and endure calmly, just as they always had. As the 2010s reached their midpoint, Hong Kong entered one of the most emotionally charged chapters in its modern history. Not because the city was collapsing, it wasn't. Not because its people were divided beyond repair, they weren't. But because Hong Kong was, for the first time, openly wrestling with the question it had silently carried for decades: what does it truly mean to be Hong Kong? The city's skyline still shimmered at night. Its harbor still bustled with global trade, its streets still pulsed with a rhythm impossible to find anywhere else in the world. But beneath that beauty, a quiet emotional storm was forming. A storm made not of violence, but of longing, identity, frustration, and uncertainty. And the Kadoories, who had survived eras shaped by empires and war, now witnessed something far more delicate. A city struggling to understand itself. A quiet role in a loud moment across Hong Kong. Voices rose, sometimes hopeful, sometimes fearful, sometimes heavy with nostalgia for a past that no longer felt reachable. Public squares filled, streets glowed under the soft light of mobile phones. Conversations stretched long into the night, carried by people who wanted to protect the place they loved in the only ways they knew how. The Kadoories did not step into these conversations, not because they didn't care, but because they understood something essential. When a city searches for its soul, it does not need direction. It needs stability. Their role was not to speak, that it was to keep the city standing while its people expressed the complexity of their hopes and fears. That a city in motion, a family in stillness. Hong Kong Electric never faltered during these years, not through demonstrations, not through tensions, not through disruptions that might have shaken a less resilient grid. Lights stayed on. Transportation systems remained powered. Hospitals stayed bright through long nights. Families returned home each evening to apartments illuminated with soft, steady light. In a city where emotions surged unpredictably, the simple act of turning on a light became a quiet reassurance, a reminder that some foundations remained unbroken. And through that steadiness, the influence of the Kadoories flowed silently across Hong Kong, never demanding recognition, never asking for gratitude. The peninsula as a refuge from the noise, while the streets outside carried tension and urgency. The interior of the peninsula remained a place of deep calm. Guests stepped into its lobby and felt the atmosphere shift, as if the hotel itself protected them from the emotional weight pressing against the city. Soft piano notes drifted through the air. Teacups clinked gently in the afternoon light. Travelers watched the skyline through windows that seemed to soften even the hardest edges of reality. The peninsula did not ignore the world outside, that it simply refused to mirror its turbulence. And the people who visited, leaders, artists, families, and those passing through, found in the hotel a moment of stillness they could not find anywhere else. The family's vision, healing through stability, not control. Where many powerful families might have attempted to influence the city's direction, the Kadoories stepped further into neutrality. They expanded philanthropic programs quietly, focusing on community mental health, poverty relief, youth opportunities, and urban greening projects. They invested in agricultural education programs that connected young people with Hong Kong's rural heritage. They funded conservation work that preserved natural spaces for families seeking peace away from the skyline. Their goal was not to fix Hong Kong's divisions. It was to support the emotional infrastructure that helped people cope with them. Their message, unspoken but deeply felt, was simple. We are here we will endure this with you. And when the city is ready to heal, we will help hold the light. Understanding a city through silence in private, the family listened to community leaders speak of rising pressures. They listened to educators describe generational disconnect. They listened to social workers who carried the emotional burdens of families stretched thin by the city's demands. These conversations revealed a truth that shaped the family's approach. Hong Kong's challenges were no longer about physical survival. They were about emotional survival, and emotional survival required not control, but compassion. A dynasty that did not break under pressure as the decade progressed. And as Hong Kong moved through some of its most emotionally intense years, many institutions faltered, confidence wavered, businesses relocated, families questioned whether the city could still support their dreams. And yet, the systems the Kadoories built, the power grids, the hospitality sanctuaries, the community programs, did not falter. Their resilience became symbolic, a reminder that even in turbulent years, Hong Kong could rely on something steady. Not political promises, not temporary solutions, but the quiet, unbroken presence of a family who had weathered every era before this one. A foundation for the next era. By the end of the 2010s, Hong Kong had changed, not destroyed, not diminished, but emotionally reshaped. The Kadoories understood that although the city had endured a difficult chapter, its story was far from over. They knew that Hong Kong, like their own family, had survived worse in the past and would find strength again in the future. Their task was the same as it had always been: to remain steady as the city learned how to become itself again. And with that steady presence, they carried Hong Kong gently into the next chapter, a chapter defined not by turmoil, but by renewal. As the decade drew to a close, Hong Kong entered a quiet, fragile phase, a moment after years of tension when the city seemed to pause, not out of exhaustion, but out of reflection. The noise faded, the streets softened. People carried a different tone in their voices, not the urgency of protest, nor the confidence of economic ascent, but a thoughtful, introspective calm. This was the space where healing often begins, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, gently, in the quiet moments after the storm. And through this calm, the Kadoories continued to provide something the city needed even more than electricity or hotel rooms. Continuity, a reminder that even after years of turbulence, Hong Kong still had anchors strong enough to keep it from drifting. A city taking its first deep breath in these post-tension years, there was a subtle shift in Hong Kong's atmosphere. Families returned to routines. Shops reopened in softer rhythms. Elders walked through parks again, pausing beneath banyan trees that had seen the city through many eras. Night markets glittered, not as brightly as before, but with a quiet determination. Hong Kong was not the same, but it was still here, still breathing, still itself. And for many, that simple truth was enough. The Kadoories stepped into a new kind of caretaking during this period. The family expanded their philanthropic efforts in ways uniquely suited to the city's emotional needs. They supported mental wellness programs in schools and community centers, housing, relief initiatives for families under financial pressure, scholarships, not for elite achievement, but for students lacking stability, cultural preservation efforts, ensuring traditions were not lost in a rapidly changing society, urban nature projects, small green pockets where people could breathe and think. These efforts weren't dramatic. They weren't designed for public praise. They were gentle acts of support, the kind that rebuilds confidence in subtle, often invisible ways. Electricity as reassurance, not utility. Hong Kong Electric remained perfectly stable, even during years of emotional strain. Even during nights when the city felt uncertain of its direction. Even during economic fluctuations that shook markets worldwide. People came home and turned on lights without thinking, without worrying, without considering the decades of infrastructure that made that simple moment possible. And yet, in times of collective stress, the stability of light meant more than anyone said aloud. It was a reminder that the city was not falling apart, that life, however altered, still held its familiar rhythms, that Hong Kong's foundations were still strong. This reliability wasn't luck. It was the product of a dynasty that had spent generations preparing for every kind of uncertainty: war, exile, transition, and now, emotional upheaval. The peninsula becomes a symbol of emotional return after years of tension. The peninsula felt different. Guests who walked through its revolving doors carried a softness in their expression, a desire for quiet, for calm, for reassurance. The hotel offered all of it effortlessly. Soft lamplight filled the lobby. Tea was served with the same quiet grace as always. Musicians played gentle melodies that seemed to settle in the chest like a slow exhale. The peninsula had survived occupation, scarcity, and reconstruction. Now it survived something more delicate: the emotional fragmentation of a city learning how to trust again. Its presence reminded people that Hong Kong still held spaces of gentleness, spaces where the future felt less threatening and the past felt less heavy. A dynasty that never claimed power, yet held influence throughout these years. Observers often wondered why the Kadoories never attempted to steer Hong Kong's direction. Not politically, not socially, not publicly, but the answer had always been simple. They understood that influence without trust is meaningless. Their role was not to correct the city, but to support it. Not to lead loudly, but to steady quietly. Their influence came not from speeches, but from presence, not from control, but from consistency. And this consistency, carried from one generation to the next, helped the city regain its footing after one of the most emotional periods in its modern history. Preparing for renewal as Hong Kong stepped out of the decade, the emotional storm began to settle. Not forgotten. Storms are never truly forgotten, but softened. The Kadoories recognized something subtle but profound. The city was ready for renewal, ready to rebuild its internal confidence, ready to reshape its aspirations, ready to rediscover the quiet resilience that had carried it through war, occupation, migration, and uncertainty for more than a century. Their next chapter would not be about holding the past together. It would be about supporting the city as it moved into the future, a future the family understood well, because they had lived through so many transitions before. And as Hong Kong looked toward that new horizon, the Kadoories prepared themselves once again to remain steady, to remain neutral, to remain essential, just as they always had. Chapter 9. A City Reawakens. The Kadoories guide Hong Kong into a new chapter of renewal. As the 2020s began, Hong Kong entered a period unlike any in its past, a quiet, almost introspective phase where the city, after years of strain and uncertainty, seemed to turn inward to reassess what truly mattered. The skyline still shimmered each night, its lights flowing across the harbor like soft reflections of memory. The ferries still crossed Victoria Harbor in their familiar rhythm, and yet, beneath these familiar patterns, Hong Kong felt gentler, more cautious, more aware of its own fragility and its own strength. This was not a moment of decline. It was a moment of recalibration, a slow, thoughtful rebalancing of a city preparing to shape its identity for the next generation. And once again, the Kadoories found themselves quietly positioned where they had always been, at the steady center of Hong Kong's unfolding story. A city healing in small movements. Recovery did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself gradually, in subtle shifts that were easy to miss unless one listened carefully. Shops reopened with a quieter, more personal warmth. Families spent more evenings together, cherishing routines once taken for granted. Community spaces filled with people eager to reconnect after years of emotional weight. Young entrepreneurs began opening small businesses, infusing the city with fresh ideas and renewed optimism. Hong Kong was not trying to return to its old self. It was trying to grow into something new, something more balanced, more resilient, more attuned to the emotional needs of its people. And the Kadoories sensed this change with the same intuition that had guided them through every era before. A family that strengthens its foundations, not its power during this time. Many large corporations responded to global uncertainty with rapid expansion or aggressive cost-cutting. But the Kadoories moved in their characteristic rhythm, slowly, gently, always thinking in decades rather than months. Hong Kong Electric strengthened its infrastructure, anticipating that the future would demand cleaner energy, smarter systems, and greater resilience against environmental stress. Engineers introduced new technologies, not abruptly, but in a way that blended seamlessly into the grid, respecting the delicate balance between innovation and reliability. The goal was not to impress investors. It was to ensure that the most dependable part of Hong Kong's life remained untouched by instability. A city healing from emotional fatigue needs its lights to stay steady. And the Kadoories knew this better than anyone. The peninsula reimagined serenity for a new world. The peninsula also entered a new chapter, not reinventing itself, but evolving softly to meet the needs of a changing world. Travelers now sought calm. They wanted stillness, mindfulness, experiences that restored rather than dazzled. And so the peninsula deepened its quiet elegance. Rooms were redesigned to feel more like sanctuaries than suites. Lighting grew softer, more natural, more aligned with circadian rhythms. Dining spaces leaned toward authenticity and warmth instead of spectacle. Wellness spaces embraced gentle practices, the kind that helped guests exhale deeply after years of tension. The hotel did not chase trends. It simply refined the peacefulness that had always defined it. And as a result, the peninsula became not merely a symbol of luxury, but a symbol of Hong Kong's ability to remain graceful in an unsteady world. The Kadoories expand their humanitarian vision. The family's philanthropy entered a new era as well, one shaped by the emotional and social needs of a post-crisis generation. They increased funding for mental health support centers for students and young professionals, environmental education programs nurturing a new generation of conservationists, elder care initiatives, recognizing a rapidly aging population, sustainable agriculture projects, strengthening food resilience, community rebuilding programs, helping neighborhoods reconnect. Their efforts did not aim to redefine Hong Kong's identity. They aimed to strengthen the human connections that keep a city alive. This was the quiet, often unseen work that holds a community together after difficult years. A shift in identity accepted with grace. Throughout this period, Hong Kong's identity continued to evolve. Some residents left, others returned. Many stayed, choosing to build lives rooted not in ambition alone, but in connection, family, and community. The Kadoories did not resist this shift. They watched it gently, understanding that cities, like families, change shape over time. And in these changes, they saw a truth that had guided them for more than a century. Strength is not found in preserving what was, but in supporting what will be a dynasty preparing for its next generation as the decade progressed. The younger members of the family stepped deeper into leadership, not with the loud energy of ambition, but with the same quiet reverence for stability that defined their ancestors. They studied the city not as a marketplace, but as a living organism, a place with needs, vulnerabilities, histories, and hopes. They understood that the family's duty was not to grow richer, but to remain dependable, to protect the lights, to protect the calm, to protect the trust the city had placed in them for generations. And so, as Hong Kong gently reawakened, the Kadoories prepared for the next chapter, not by expanding outward, but by deepening their roots. The dynasty that began with exile now stood as one of the few constants in a city still learning how to heal. As the decade unfolded, Hong Kong continued moving through its quiet renewal. Not a sudden restoration, not a dramatic transformation, but a slow return to emotional steadiness. The city's pace softened just enough for people to notice the details they once overlooked. The glow of shop fronts at dusk, the gentle sway of the harbor's currents, the familiar hum of trams gliding through the streets. Life felt delicate, but it also felt intentional, as though the entire city had decided, collectively and silently, to rebuild itself with greater care. And through this tender reconstruction, the Kadoories remained present in the same way they always had, not leading the city, not shaping its identity, but supporting its quiet steps toward the future. Electricity as a promise, not a service. In these years, Hong Kong Electric underwent a transformation more profound than any before it, not because the technology was revolutionary, but because the purpose behind it deepened. The family recognized that a modern city demanded more than reliable power. IT demanded sustainable power, clean power, power that could carry Hong Kong into the next generation without compromising the world that generation would inherit. And so, with their signature patience, they began introducing gentle but significant changes. New emission-reducing technologies whispered into the grid. Smarter monitoring systems tightened reliability even further. Small pilot projects explored renewable integration without risking the city's stability. They didn't boast about these changes. They didn't turn them into corporate campaigns or public announcements. They simply improved the city's foundation, quietly, steadily, invisibly, and each improvement became a kind of promise. Hong Kong will be able to breathe easier in the future, and the lights will never dim while we are here. The peninsula embraces a softer luxury post-crisis. Travelers sought something different, not extravagance, but peace, and the peninsula adapted with a calm, almost meditative confidence. Its suites were redesigned with natural textures and soothing palettes. Wellness spaces offered restorative rituals rooted in stillness rather than spectacle. Dining menus highlighted comfort, warmth, and grounded flavors. Art installations leaned on themes of reflection, balance, and renewal. Guests no longer visited solely for luxury. They visited for calm, for a moment to breathe, for a place where the outside noise dissolved into gentle echoes. The peninsula became a sanctuary for a city and a world still learning how to heal. Supporting the city's emotional foundations, the Kadoories' philanthropy expanded further into areas that were once overlooked but now essential. Programs supporting caregivers carrying emotional burdens, scholarships for students navigating uncertain futures, community centers for families needing stability, reforestation and ecological restoration projects that soften the city's sharp edges. These initiatives were not created in reaction to crisis. They were created in anticipation of recovery, the kind of recovery that nurtures the heart of a city, not just its economy. Quietly, the family helped Hong Kong rediscover its sense of connection. A new generation learns the old philosophy. As younger members of the Kadoorie family stepped deeper into leadership, they did not attempt to modernize the dynasty's philosophy. They attempted to preserve it. They learned that endurance is not maintained through bold gestures, but through consistency, that influence is not earned through authority, but through trust, and that the family story, stretching from Baghdad to Shanghai to Hong Kong, was not a story of conquering empires, but of outlasting them through dignity and restraint. They stepped into their roles with humility, with gentleness, with an understanding that their duty was not to reinvent the family name, but to continue it. Hong Kong rediscovers its rhythm slowly, quietly, beautifully, the city began to find coherence again. Children laughed along the waterfront during weekend strolls. Small businesses filled street corners with warmth. Artists returned to their craft, capturing the city's evolving identity with new sensitivity. Residents found comfort in rituals, morning breakfasts, evening walks, shared meals. Hong Kong was not returning to what it once was. It was becoming something more tender, more self-aware, more emotionally grounded. And the Kadoories' presence, subtle, constant, unobtrusive, remained woven through this renewal like a soft thread holding the fabric together, a dynasty rooted in the future. By now, the family understood that the city's next era would bring new trials, global changes in climate, economic restructuring, technological shifts, and emotional challenges still unfolding in the hearts of its people. But they also understood something deeper. Hong Kong had survived every era before this one because its people, like the Kadoories, knew how to endure gently. And so, as the city continued its quiet ascent back into confidence, the family prepared themselves not with fear, but with calm expectation, because they had learned long ago that resilience is not loud. Resilience is a whisper that says, "We will remain steady while the world changes around us." And once again, they remained steady. As Hong Kong moved deeper into the 2020s, the city found itself navigating a world changing faster than any era before it. Not through conflict, not through political upheaval alone, but through global transformations that altered how people lived, worked, and connected. Markets fluctuated with unpredictable momentum. Technology reshaped daily routines with quiet inevitability. The meaning of community evolved as digital life blended with physical presence, and families learned to balance ambition with well-being. A balance Hong Kong had struggled to maintain for generations. And through these delicate adjustments, the Kadoories remained what they had always been, a constant, a calm presence, a quiet assurance that the city could rely on its foundations, even as everything around it continued to change. A city tries to understand what truly matters after years of emotional heaviness. Hong Kong entered a reflective phase, a period where individuals, families, and entire communities began to ask themselves gentle, meaningful questions. What kind of life do we want? What kind of city are we creating? What does success look like now? What do we want to keep? And what must we let go of? These were not loud questions. They emerged slowly, in quiet conversations over tea, in evening walks along the pier, in the soft hesitations of people planning the next chapter of their lives. Hong Kong was no longer striving to regain what it once had. It was beginning to imagine what it could become. And the Kadoories, whose lives had been shaped by adaptation across continents and centuries, understood this process intimately. Electricity becomes a symbol of security. Hong Kong Electric continued to operate with extraordinary consistency. And in this new era, that consistency carried deeper meaning. In a world defined by uncertainty, people needed small, predictable comforts, light when they returned home, the hum of appliances at dawn, the reassurance that their daily routines would remain undisturbed. The Kadoories' energy infrastructure became more than a utility. It became a symbol of stability, a soft reminder that some parts of Hong Kong remained unshaken. To those who felt lost in the world's rapid changes, the steady glow of a lamp in a bedroom window meant more than anyone could measure. The peninsula becomes a place of reflection, not escape. The peninsula evolved again, quietly, subtly. Guests no longer came only for luxury or prestige. They came to feel grounded, rooms filled with natural light. Spaces encouraged calm reflection rather than opulence. Wellness programs emphasized slow breathing, gentle movement, the art of being present. In an era when the world moved relentlessly fast, the hotel offered the opposite, a place where time expanded instead of contracting, where silence felt like healing, where calm became an experience, not an absence. Visitors began describing the peninsula not as a hotel, but as a temporary home for the spirit. The family deepens its commitment to emotional infrastructure. The Kadoories increasingly directed their attention toward initiatives that supported Hong Kong's emotional resilience. Programs helping young people manage societal pressure, funding for quiet community spaces where residents could gather without expectation, environmental projects designed to reconnect people with nature, grants for cultural work that preserved Hong Kong's unique identity. Their philanthropy no longer responded to crisis. The IT anticipated the emotional needs of a city evolving in real time. They understood that people did not only need resources, they needed grounding. They needed places where life felt manageable again, that a soft influence felt across the city. The Kadoories never asked for recognition, yet their influence was felt everywhere. In the quiet hum of a generator powering a hospital at midnight, in a family gathering comfortably lit by steady electricity, in a weary traveler finding peace in a peninsula suite, in a child attending a school funded by the family's foundation, in the gentle preservation of Hong Kong's green spaces. They shaped the city not through power, but through presence, not through policy, but through compassion, not through ambition, but through endurance. A city and a dynasty intertwined by this stage in Hong Kong's evolution. The relationship between the city and the Kadoories had become something rare, not transactional, not political, not strategic, but mutual. Hong Kong had given the family a place to rebuild their lives after exile, and in return, the family had given Hong Kong a century of stability, gentleness, and resilience. Their stories no longer ran parallel. They ran together, interwoven through power grids, hotel walls, parks, charities, and the quiet rituals of everyday life. Preparing for the next great turning point, both the city and the family sensed that the next era would be transformative, shaped by climate change, technological acceleration, regional shifts, and new social expectations. But rather than bracing for impact, the Kadoories prepared with calm acceptance. They had learned long ago that the future does not reward fear, it rewards steadiness. And so they stood ready, not as defenders of the past, but as stewards of continuity. That a dynasty that began with nothing now served as the quiet backbone of a global metropolis searching for balance in a shifting world. Chapter 10. The Quiet Future. How the Kadoories prepare Hong Kong for a world yet to come. As Hong Kong stepped deeper into the 2020s, the city found itself standing at the edge of a new horizon, one shaped not by the forces that had defined earlier eras, but by challenges and opportunities woven into the fabric of the modern world. Climate pressures, technological acceleration, a shifting global economy, new patterns of migration, the search for identity in a world without stillness. These were not storms that arrived with sudden violence. They unfolded gradually, quietly reshaping the future in ways both subtle and profound. And through these shifts, the Kadoories, now guided by a younger generation carrying the wisdom of their ancestors, prepared not for crisis, but for stewardship. For the first time in their long history, the dynasty was acting not only to preserve Hong Kong's stability, but to shape its resilience for a century yet to come. That a new generation raised on the lessons of the past, the new members of the Kadoorie family grew up hearing stories not only of wealth and business, but of exile, adaptation, and the profound responsibility of endurance. They learned that their ancestors survived because they listened before acting, observed before deciding, served before leading. These stories did not make them nostalgic. They made them patient. They understood that Hong Kong's challenges would not be solved through ambition alone, but through a calm, continuous commitment to the systems that supported daily life. Electricity for a changing planeta's global temperatures rose and environmental concerns intensified across Asia. The Kadoories recognized that the next great test for Hong Kong electric was not stability alone, but sustainability. They began preparing the grid for a world where energy needed to be. Plans were drafted for greener generation methods. Old facilities were quietly updated to reduce emissions. Branches of the company researched renewable integrations that honored both the planet and the city's need for consistency. They understood that the transition could not be rushed. Hong Kong depended too deeply on reliable power, but it also could not be delayed, so they moved carefully, introducing solutions as gently as light rolling across a room at sunrise. The peninsula becomes a sanctuary for the future in an unpredictable world. People sought not spectacle, but grounding. The peninsula embraced this shift with quiet innovation. Nature-infused design created a sense of calm in an increasingly digital age. Sustainable materials replaced luxury that felt excessive or outdated. Suites were designed to feel like personal retreats, spaces where stillness could be felt rather than imagined. Wellness programs integrated practices meant to restore emotional balance in lives pulled in too many directions. The hotel was no longer simply preserving tradition. It was redefining what luxury meant in a world that craved peace. The family strengthens its environmental legacy. The Kadoories expanded their conservation efforts even further, recognizing that Hong Kong's future could not be separated from its natural heritage. These projects reflected a core belief woven into every chapter of their story. A city that loses its connection to nature loses its ability to breathe. That a city searching for balance, a family offering stability as economic pressures, housing concerns, and global uncertainties continued to shape Hong Kong's emotional landscape. The Kadoories remained committed to strengthening the city's quiet foundations. They supported community mental health programs. They funded green urban projects that gave families places to rest and reconnect. They expanded educational paths for young people, reshaping their futures in uncertain times. These were not business decisions. They were acts of responsibility, a recognition that a city survives not through wealth, but through the well-being of its people. The dynasty's softest power. Its continuity, what allowed the Kadoories to endure while so many other families rose and fell. It was not wealth. It was not influence. It was not strategy. It was continuity. A thread of resilience passed from one generation to the next, unbroken by war, unshaken by political transitions, unaltered by modern pressures. This continuity became something the city relied on, not consciously, but deeply in a world of rapid change. The quiet presence of a family that had endured everything before offered a sense of stability that no institution could replicate. That a future not defined by them, but supported by them. The Kadoories never believed the city belonged to them. They believed they belonged to the city. Their purpose was never dominance. It was stewardship. And stewardship, they understood, is measured not by how loudly one leads, but by how gently one supports. As Hong Kong looked beyond the uncertainties of the present, preparing for a century where its challenges would be new and its opportunities vast. The dynasty prepared with it, quietly, patiently, faithfully, not to shape Hong Kong's future, but to steady it, not to guide its identity, but to protect its foundation, not to claim its destiny, but to ensure that destiny remained possible. That a family that began with exile had become the calm heartbeat of a global city ready to face the unknown. As Hong Kong moved further into the 2020s and beyond, the city began to reveal a truth it had carried quietly for decades, that its spirit, its survival, its resilience, its extraordinary ability to adapt, was never tied to the governments that ruled it, nor the fortunes that flowed through its markets, nor the global powers that shaped its destiny. Its spirit lived in the people who stayed, who worked, who endured, who cared for the city even when they did not fully understand where it was heading. And among these caretakers stood the Kadoories, a family whose story had become so deeply interwoven with Hong Kong's identity that to speak of the city's endurance was, in a way, to speak of theirs. Standing steady in a world that refuses to stand still. The world continued to shift. Economic tides rose and fell. Geopolitical landscapes reshaped themselves. Technological breakthroughs changed how people lived and connected. And environmental pressures intensified with each passing year. In this era of rapid, unpredictable change, many institutions struggled to adapt. Many families sought safer ground elsewhere. Many corporations moved their focus away from Hong Kong. But the Kadoories remained exactly where they had always been. Here, present, quietly observing, quietly strengthening, quietly supporting the city that had given them a second beginning generations ago. Hong Kong Electric. A promise passed from one era to the next even as new challenges emerged, rising temperatures, growing populations, storms shaped by a changing climate. The city's power grid held. Lights continued to shine across the harbor each night, reflecting a skyline that had become one of the world's most recognizable. Hospitals, schools, markets, and homes continued to rely on the steady heartbeat of electricity that flowed through systems the family had maintained with unwavering care. To most people, this reliability was simply part of life. But to those who understood Hong Kong's long, fragile history, the uninterrupted flow of power symbolized something deeper. No matter how the world changed, Hong Kong would not fall into darkness. And behind that promise stood a family who had survived far deeper darkness in their own past, the peninsula. A legacy of stillness in an uncertain world. The peninsula, once a symbol of elegance, then a symbol of resilience, became something even more profound in the city's modern age. A living archive of Hong Kong's emotional history. Its walls had absorbed the whispers of diplomats, the worries of travelers, the hopes of families beginning new lives, and the sighs of a city seeking comfort during difficult years. Now, it held the calm of renewal. Guests described the hotel as a place where the city's noise dissolved, where the weight of uncertainty lifted, where time seemed to slow down just enough to let the mind rest. In a world that asked people to move faster each year. The peninsula reminded them that healing often happens in stillness, the dynasty preparing to pass. The light forward as younger generations of Kadoories stepped fully into leadership. They did so with a kind of reverence, not for wealth or influence, but for the responsibility that had defined their family for centuries. They studied environmental science, urban development, social well-being, technological ethics, and community resilience. They understood that the next century would demand not the same solutions as the last, but the same values: patience, humility, adaptability, compassion, neutrality, steadiness. And so they prepared themselves not to command Hong Kong's future, but to support it gently, as their ancestors had done when the family first arrived from Baghdad with nothing but perseverance and hope. That a city and a family bound together by resilience. Hong Kong's story has never been simpled. It has been marked by displacement and opportunity, by hardship and transformation, by silence and renewal. The Kadoorie story follows the same arc. They did not conquer a city. They did not build an empire through force. They did not seek to rule or dominate. They endured, and through endurance, they helped Hong Kong endure too. Their influence cannot be measured in wealth alone. It lives in the steady hum of power lines, in the glow of hotel lights reflected on the harbor, in the quiet strength of community institutions sustained by their philanthropy, in the trust they earned by never abandoning the city, even when the world around them shifted beyond recognition. The eternal light in the end. The Kadoorie story is not about business or power or even legacy. It is about light, literal and symbolic. The light that flows through Hong Kong each night. The light that guides ships through Victoria Harbor. The light that fills quiet rooms where families gather after long days. The light that reminds a city it is still alive, still moving forward, still capable of renewal. And behind that light stands a dynasty that has outlived empires, survived exile, witnessed wars, weathered transitions, and remained steady through every chapter. A family who became not the rulers of Hong Kong, but its gentle guardians. The dynasty whose greatest power was simply the ability to stay. And so, the story of the Kadoorie Dynasty settles into the present, quietly, softly, the same way their influence has always moved through Hong Kong. From a family of refugees to the gentle custodians of a global city, their journey was never about power, but about endurance. Not about ruling, but about remaining. Not about claiming a legacy, but about protecting the light that carries a city from one era into the next. Hong Kong has changed 1,000 times. It will change 1,000 more. But through every shift, every uncertainty, every moment when the city pauses to find its breath, the quiet presence of the Kadoorie family remains, steady as the glow of the harbor at night, constant as the hum of electricity beneath its streets. As you drift into sleep tonight, remember this: some dynasties rise through force, others rise through brilliance. But the rarest of all, the ones that shape history without ever demanding recognition, rise through resilience. Thank you for listening to this story. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you'd like more calm, cinematic documentaries like this, gently press subscribe to Money Vault so you never miss the next journey through history's hidden empires. Good night, and thank you for being here.